All of them responded very positively to our invitation. Thank you to the group secretariat for the organization of this event, which can be done thanks to their work and commitment. And finally, thank you all for being with us today. This is the first event organized by the Socialists and Democrats Working Group in the Artificial Intelligence Special Committee, the first of a series that we have called Democratic Artificial Intelligence. We want to build up collective thinking and promote debates on what would our model of digitalization be, what types of artificial intelligence systems we want or we need for our society, how to provide citizens with a better understanding of the changes and the challenges we are facing, and which are the regulatory tools that we, as legislators, should consider in order to make a democratic AI. Democratization of artificial intelligence systems are up to all of us, citizens, stakeholders, academy, and regulators, and it's our responsibility to expand the understanding of a culture of AI. For the S&D, we want a democratic AI in Europe, which will be inspired by a humanistic principle. It should fully respect the Charter and thereby respect human dignity, autonomy, and self-determination of the individual, prevent harm, promote fairness, inclusion, and transparency, eliminate biases and discrimination, including as regards minority groups, and respect and comply with the principles of limiting the negative externalities of technology used, of ensuring explainability of technologies, and of guaranteeing that technologies are there to serve people and not to replace or decide for them, with the ultimate aim of increasing every human being's well-being. The democratic AI in Europe must respect ethical principles, our European values and principles, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and be subject to the legal safeguards. The democratic AI in Europe must be based on principles of non-discrimination, protection of privacy and personal data, transparency, trustworthiness, safety, accessibility, and accountability. The democratic AI in Europe shall be socially fair and environmentally sustainable, and it must contribute to further advancing the European values of freedom, democracy, equality, and solidarity. We want a social responsible AI. Our first event on the Democratic AI series focuses in the AI's technological diversification to counter market concentration. The continuing and ever-increasing corporate concentration and commercialization of the online economy, the market dominance and market concentration of a small number of big tech companies which are developing AI technologies and investing in AI ventures is increasingly becoming a matter of concern. Market concentration, monopoly positions, and excessive share in the market result in unfair competition, which inevitably increases social and economic inequalities and undermines the public interest, as opposed to increased diversification, which would ensure a more transparent and democratic environment in the field of AI. At the same time, public investments on AI should focus towards an increased AI diversity in research and innovation, deriving from the purely commercial-led interest to focus on a societal well-being. We are going to explore and share ideas on how to make this diversification happen in order to help us drive the future digitalization of our societies. Thank you again for being with us today and for your participation in this webinar.
So hello all together, even from my side, welcome to this webinar. It's my big pleasure to welcome you all to the topic AI's technological diversification, how to counter the market concentration. Last year, dear ladies and gentlemen, the Democratic members in the United States Congress described the tactics of the 4 biggest technology companies which they use to gain and maintain the dominant position in online search, advertising, social network, or shopping. First, Amazon holds a monopoly over, or monopoly power, let me be clear, over many of the small merchants who have no other place to go to reach their online consumers, and it is promoting its own goods and services. Second, Apple holds a monopoly on distributing software onto its iPhone, and it's including rival apps and services and creating competing services and futures. And when I lead further to the third one, which is Facebook, Facebook holds a monopoly power in the social networking market by copying and acquiring potential rivals before they could grow in competitiveness. And Facebook's two biggest acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp illustrate this monopoly position. All these big companies are also developing AI technologies and investing in AI ventures. A bigger diversification in AI development would ensure a more transparent and democratic environment in the field of artificial intelligence. And the market concentration and monopoly power inevitably result in unfair competition, which further exacerbates the social and economic inequalities and undermine the public interest. And any future legislation on artificial intelligence must take into account the broader issue of multi-billion capital concentrated in the hands of the few companies, including questions over public funding offered to private companies through various programs which strengthen their monopolies in the digital economy. And based on the Commission's guidelines on AI's ethics and trustworthiness, the artificial intelligence technologies should fulfill 7 requirements, including diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness. Increased diversification in AI technologies and development would ensure more transparency and better democracy accountability. And ladies and gentlemen, the technological diversification of AI should start with greater diversity in designing of algorithms, which would better reflect our society and favor presence of women and minority groups. And gender equality and diversity among algorithm programmers and developers for sure should be actively supported. And the main underlying object of today's webinar is to discuss how to democratize, difficult words, artificial intelligence. And in order to make it truly human-centric, socially fair, and advancing the European values of freedom, democracy, and equality. And I'm delighted to see such an excellent selection of expert speakers. And on behalf of the S&D group, I'm looking forward to their input to this crucial debate, which should provide us, the European legislators, with knowledge, new ideas, and food for thought. Thank you for this, and I'm really excited to listen to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Dear friends, dear comrades, it's a pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar on the issue of market concentration of digital services. We thought of proposing a debate on this topic already some months ago, as we were starting our work on AI within the AIDA committee, because we see this as one of the key factors hampering a healthy digital environment where consumers and citizens are protected, small operators and startups can thrive, and where public administration do not risk to be too dependent on a few private companies. Indeed, this goes beyond competition considerations, as technological dependence is multifaceted and has a number of implications. Think about depending for security purposes on applications and cameras coming from outside of Europe and easily hackable, as we found out thanks to investigative journalists. Think about AI systems at school involving children's privacy and security, an issue we raised in the report on AI in culture and education. Indeed, one issue to consider is also the dependence of public administration on AI systems coming from a few big tech companies, as they do not have the competences and resources to develop in-house systems, but rather resort to procurement with risks of focusing more on pricing as selection criterion rather than on robustness, data protection, and so on, or public-private partnerships, therefore with non-proprietary software. These are just some of the reasons to advocate for more diversity and against market concentration. I believe today many will mention the Facebook blackout, which clearly shows the entity of the problem. We will learn if the current initiatives we are working on are enough, what more needs to be done, and how the future could look like if we really manage to create a digital single market where consumers are empowered and where small operators are not prevented from, but rather encouraged to enter tech markets, ensuring compliance with our European values. DMA will play a big role in this, together with the SA. Of course, a lot will depend also on how we tackle data and their controlled access in a democratic way. The Data Governance Act is another step in this direction, although maybe not ambitious enough, and we expect a lot from the Data Act and from the establishment of common European data spaces. The AI Act also foresees some provisions for small operators. We will see if this is enough, as AI development holds intrinsic risks of concentration. But knowing that complying with a stringent set of rules, especially for high-risk systems, should not be disputed, even by small businesses, if we want to uphold the European model for AI. So, as you see, we have a lot to discuss on with excellent speakers, and I'm sure today's debate will enrich our reflections on how to regulate digital and emerging technologies. Thank you very much.
Yes, we just had a shift of person here. My name is Crystal Schaldemose. I'm a rapporteur on the DSA here in the European Parliament, and I will have the honor of guiding you through the first panel where we're going to discuss more in details on these very important topics that we have been hearing about in the introduction. We are under a certain time pressure now, so I will not make a long statement, but just say that it is extremely important that we have these discussions, but we also need to know more, and therefore we have invited many, many good speakers to help us learning more about what happens, and on that basis we expect to be able to discuss and hopefully also find good solutions. The first panel is about tackling market concentration, and just to set the scene very, very fast. You know, the 5th of October, Facebook, Instagram, Messengers, and WhatsApp closed down due to some technical problems. That caused really, really many problems globally. And for me, it became very evident that they are really having a huge impact on our society, these platforms and these services. And therefore, we have to discuss what can we do in order to create better competition so more companies can come and give us these kind of services so we're not dependent on a few big one. I don't mind them being big, but if they are the only one, they have de facto monopoly status, we have a problem. That is what we're going to discuss. What can we do about it? And we have, in this first panel, 5 excellent speakers that will give each of them will give us their specific perspective, and after that I will allow for a brief Q&A if the times allows us. So I think that, so please, to all the speakers, I know that you have been given up to 8 minutes each. You don't have to spend all the 8 minutes if you don't feel for it. And I know, being a politician, it's very difficult to make your statement short, but we learn it here in the Parliament because we are only given 1.5 minutes speaking time. So it is possible to still have a clear message. Anyway, I will stop speaking because I think it's more interesting to listen to you. And therefore, the first speaker that I am so honored to welcome is Helena Malikova from the European Commission. Helena is member of the chief economist team at DG Competition. Very welcome to you, Helena. I will not spend a lot of time introducing you. I think that we would be happy if you could say a couple of words on yourself, but we are very much looking forward to your perspective from the more financial side on this question. How can we tackle market concentration? What can we do that we don't do today? And how can we be more sure to succeed than we are doing today? So very much welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have some slides, if they could come up. I'll try to be very short, and I'll actually dive directly to the topic, because what I want to discuss today is important. I want to discuss market power and the way we measure market power. That became much more challenging in the digital era with zero-priced goods. So that is why market power and measuring is so central for the DMA. So if you just one slide further, if you can just move one slide. Thank you. I'll go briefly through the history, actually, of the EU antitrust enforcement for this purpose. And you know that we do measure market power in terms of market shares. That's central to the way we conceive market power and the way the DigiComp's ability is there to intervene in the economy. On the other hand, some empirical work that we've been running with the Hertie School seems to reinforce this long-standing intuition that it's not only about market shares, that actual size itself matters. And that's what I would really like to focus on today. So it is something that is being discussed, as you are aware, in the US, and I'm actually a little bit surprised why it's not more discussed already in my house, so in DigiComp. We will look a little bit closer now at the recent history of antitrust in Europe and what happened around the turn of the century, because I believe that this explains some of the current constraints around the way we perceive market power. And there has been a lot, in fact, written about the influence of the Chicago School on the US enforcement. So let me show you a little bit how it happened in Europe. So if we go to the next slide. So as you know, the EU antitrust policy has been introduced, basically the antitrust rules had been introduced after the Second World War, but in the Rome Treaty itself, there was no merger control. And there was, of course, prohibition of abuse of dominant position, cartels, and illegal state aid, but merger control was introduced only as late as 1989. And so this period of, the period that followed the introduction of merger control could be qualified a little bit as an overdrive, actually, by the Europeans in that area. So we are late 90s, and there is the financial bubble, a record number of mergers being notified, that coincides with the nomination of Mario Monti, a famed enforcer from the internal market portfolio, to the top of the competition portfolio. And at the institutional level, here you see so Mario Monti is the first portrait to the left here among the recent history of competition commissioners. So basically at the level of the DigiComp, there was this merger task force that was instituted. And as an illustration of this activist attitude, if we go to the next slide, and actually the perceived arrogance of this attitude of the bureaucracy, as was described at the time, this is this sign that the merger task force attributed to itself. It's a sheriff badge with a piranha in the middle. So this, if we go again one slide further, so basically this period of activist enforcement in Europe, which was very brief, culminated with this decision in 2001 to prohibit the GE Honeywell merger. So a merger between what is the equivalent of national champions in the US And there was a huge, that followed by a diplomatic crisis, in fact, between Europe and the US, with George W. Bush intervening publicly to say how concerned he is about the EU blocking this merger. And the criticism that the US, this diplomatic incident took, the criticism by the US of the EU took the form of belittling a relatively short experience in antitrust enforcement. And very specifically, they claim that we don't have a rigorous economic analysis. So to resolve this conflict, the DG Comp instituted the chief economist team, where I'm homed these days. So this chief economist was a safeguard against this activist enforcement. But what is very important here is that we took over this kind of economic approach at the moment when the US was at the height of the influence of the Chicago School economics, because this is when the US abandoned the Microsoft antitrust case under the influence of the Chicago School under the second Bush administration. So basically, so we took over basically the most laissez-faire, and this is what I want to summarize, is that the effect of this GE Honeywell case, which was then also endorsed this approach by the European courts in 3 decisions where they have annulled 3 past merger prohibitions by the Commission. We took over an economic approach which is very, very much a laissez-faire Chicago School economics. And so this is what serves today to, I think, diminish the enthusiasm to be active in the enforcement. If we go to the next slide, I just would like to show how this translates in our legal test. So here, in order to run a competition case, we need to have basically established market power, and this is what we're discussing today, then a theory of harm. And what came through, however, with this new economic approach is, if you go one slide further, is just one slide further, please. Thank you. Is this adding this kind of countervailing factor, this mitigating factor of market power? So even if you're dominant, even if you are abusing your dominance, be it in the form of increased prices, which is the Chicago School paradigm, you can still be okay because you will show that there are efficiencies. So efficiencies is this jargon to say basically, it comes from this concept that if you have a factory and you double production, you will probably don't have to double the number of machines. And we have transposed this logic that comes from this industrial economics thinking to digital. And I will argue in the second part of this presentation that maybe we should not have done that so wholesale. So if we now move forward, thank you. So there is a significant debate about the importance of market power in the antitrust enforcement. And now in this part of the presentation, I would like to go more into the analysis that we did empirically, so from theory to facts. So I will present a few illustrations here. So we can move one slide further. So again, to basically illustrate where we stand, we are here on the dominance, the first step of any action by the competition authorities. So the next slide, this is, thank you. This is basically presenting something we have been looking at HERTI, but also it is confirmed by a lot of other economists, which see a correlation between basically profitability and the size of companies. The size of companies measured by market capitalization. Profitability here, being very profitable, is a sign, is an indication of market power. So what we see across critical sectors of the economy is that the bigger you are in terms of your value to the shareholders, the market capitalization, the more market power you seem to have. So this chart basically, if we go further, I'm trying to. So now I'm going to discuss this mitigating factor, the efficiency story that I kind of introduced very briefly. So when you have market power, it seems that when you're big, you have some. Is it mitigated by the fact that you became so efficient? So here, in order to check a little bit this assumption, as I said, we do believe that, and that there is a lot of impact of this efficiency narrative on our enforcement. What we did is we looked at 10 years of merger transactions. So when you become bigger for a merger, do you become more effective? Do you reduce your costs to the benefit of your consumers? And here empirically what we so far analyzed is that a non-digital company, so your standard manufacturing company will still be indeed announcing that they will reduce these costs and potentially to the benefit, but not necessarily of the consumers. But digital mergers do not even most of the time at all announce any savings of costs. They at best announced what is called revenue synergies. And we have a bit of like red flag because we don't really know what revenue synergies is. So in economics, synergies and efficiency sound good, but revenue synergies could just be very sophisticated language to say we're going to have more market power and we're going to increase prices. So with that in mind, if we go to my last slide, thank you, it's basically this is the test as I described it of a merger case where you have to establish dominance typically in market shares. I would like to argue that if we go, sorry, the very last slide. So one more. Thank you. I would like to compare this to the approach of the DMA, and I would like to say that it's the empirical studies that we have been running, the empirical analysis at Hertie at least, would probably plead in favor of the DMA approach to basically the digital hypercapitalizations, because they do, for the first time, we don't, and they do take into account market capitalization when measuring market power, when deciding who is a gatekeeper, and there is no assumption, there is no upfront assumption of efficiencies. So I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much. Very, very interesting. Can I ask you a very quick question before I go on to the next speaker? I mean, this is very interesting, and you said that now we are doing things with the DMA, looking into the gatekeeper aspects of this as well. But could we have been doing more at an earlier stage to make sure that we could control the big tech giants? I mean, I think you're right that there has been a laissez-faire in the Commission to a certain extent. We have had many chances. I was myself rapporteur on the platform to business regulation in the last mandate, and I fought very much for fairness to be put into that piece of legislation, and the Commission was completely against. They just wanted transparency. So have we missed some opportunities to do more due to this Chicago school laissez-faire policy? Or do you think that we didn't really realize that they would become so big and therefore we are stuck with the situation now? Is Malikova?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Thank you. So I just wanted to say that I don't think that the Commission necessarily can do much more because it is eventually a question of the Luxembourg courts. So as long as the Luxembourg courts will be holding DG to the test of the Chicago school, which is de facto, I believe, partially the case today, where the harm to consumers is purely measured in terms of increase in price, that is very difficult to implement in a zero price context. As long as the court will be holding us to that test, we as competition authorities from the Commission from Brussels can't do much.
So this is not a question alone on, I mean, if we do something in the legislation, make a better legislation, you still say that it is, we are completely dependent on the courts. I thought that the court had to follow the legislation.
If you change the legislation of competition, yes. So that I'm talking about my part of the house. And if the test of what is harm to the consumers is wider, and it does take into account, it does take into as a reference point citizens rather than consumers only, of course you will change that, and you can change that as legislators. But we as enforcers can't change that.
No. Fair enough. Thank you very much. I already got a couple of extra ideas for the ESA, I have to say. So really, really great. Well, the time is flying away because it's so interesting. And I will run directly to the next speaker. And she is with me here in the room, which is a big pleasure for me. And therefore, I'm really happy to welcome Patricia Cires from the European Economic and Social Committee, where you are Vice President of the Employers Group. And I'm looking so much forward to listen to your presentation. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be physically present here. So, because I'm based in Brussels, so it is a pleasure for me. And thank you so much for the invitation and the initiative to have this debate. And if you don't mind, I will shift to Spanish because I think I can speak in my mother language because I see. So Thank you so much. Ahora sí, ahora sí. Gracias. Es que, thank you. Voy a intentar no llegar ni siquiera a los 8 minutos, pero sí quería hacer una breve introducción porque me voy a centrar básicamente en los dos. No, vale. Bien. Bueno, me voy a centrar básicamente en los usos de la inteligencia artificial, no tanto para luego extraer evidentemente unas conclusiones más generales. Lo primero que tenemos que tener en cuenta es que la inteligencia artificial o los usos y funcionalidades de la inteligencia artificial tienen un potencial prácticamente ilimitado por lo que tenemos ahora. Es decir, hay un componente muy importante de evolución tecnológica que tenemos que tener en cuenta y la innovación que ello conlleva. ¿Vale? Entonces, y además, ¿por qué? Porque precisamente estamos hablando ahora mismo de inteligencia artificial precisamente por dos causas, entre las muchas, pero una de ellas es, uno, la consumerización o generalización del uso de la economía del dato a través del Big Data, del análisis o la capacidad de tratamiento y análisis del Big Data. Cada vez más también por parte de las empresas, no todas, como dar unas cifras ahora mismo. Y luego también gracias a la construcción o el desarrollo de computación en la nube, es decir, almacenar toda la información en la nube, que ha sido posible, entre otras cuestiones, al despliegue de las infraestructuras de conectividad, sin las cuales evidentemente no estaríamos hablando de economía digital. Entonces, estas dos cuestiones, digamos que la inteligencia artificial es el desarrollo, ¿vale? Es en donde estamos ahora, pero de manera incipiente. Digo de manera incipiente, sabemos que entre las funcionalidades que estamos hablando de inteligencia artificial está desde la automatización de procesos, robotización, gracias al software, a la evolución y perfeccionamiento de los software y también del uso de los algoritmos, que decíamos, aprendizaje de máquinas, machine learning, pero también interfaces conversacionales, que es donde estamos para las empresas de servicios. Son los chatbots que nos salen ahora, porque podemos hablar en, por ejemplo, una aerolínea, estoy pensando en el primer ejemplo que me viene a la cabeza. Esas son las funcionalidades entre otras muchas. Pero es que aunque estábamos hablando al principio de concentración de mercados y unos pocos players que hay que tener en cuenta que las empresas, el nivel de penetración de la inteligencia artificial es muy bajo todavía. Estamos en el último estudio del Ministerio de Economía y Transformación Digital de España sobre la base de datos de Eurostat, nos dice que la media europea de inclusión de la inteligencia artificial en las empresas españolas y europeas es 6%, empresas españolas un 7%. Es decir, todavía hay mucho camino para permitir que las empresas acojan y se beneficien de las ventajas competitivas que significa esta tecnología. Yo creo que es una de las cuestiones que tenemos que prestar atención. De ahí que en el Comité Económico y Social Europeo, en el grupo empleador, concretamente, hemos realizado un estudio cuyas conclusiones presentamos en junio de 2021, es decir, hace muy poquitos meses, sobre promover el uso de la inteligencia artificial en las pequeñas y medianas empresas y las microempresas. Es decir, cuáles son los obstáculos y cuáles son las soluciones que podemos poner encima de la mesa para promover pues una mayor utilización. Porque para las empresas las ventajas competitivas son enormes en términos de transformación de procesos, de mejora de operaciones, mejor prestación de servicios a los clientes y mejora captura y fidelización de los mismos, y relaciones también con los empleados y recursos humanos en general. Es decir, las aplicaciones son positivas, no son negativas. Sin embargo, los obstáculos son de 5 o 6, ¿vale? Esos 6 tipos de obstáculos para las micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas, sobre todo para micro y pequeñas empresas. El primero de ellos tiene que ver con la capacitación, la formación en digitalización, más allá del nivel de usuarios. El segundo tiene que ver también con, y en eso también estamos trabajando, con la falta de concienciación por parte del propio equipo directivo de la empresa de las ventajas o potenciales ventajas que supone la penetración de la asunción de tecnologías de inteligencia artificial para sus propios negocios. El tercero es el propio coste asociado a la tecnología de inteligencia artificial. Y de ahí hay una cuestión muy importante que viene al hilo de cómo generar un mayor level playing field en el mercado interior europeo, y es generar más acceso a la financiación y, por tanto, generar un entorno propicio al emprendimiento y a las startups en Europa, en la Unión Europea, que favorezca precisamente pues eso, todo un ecosistema de desarrollo, o sea, de evolución, de desarrollo, de captación, de penetración de tecnologías digitales y de inteligencia artificial, que estamos hablando en particular. El cuarto sería el volumen de datos generados que se necesita para mantener las funcionalidades de la inteligencia artificial. Cuando hablamos de micropymes y pequeñas empresas es más complicado, con lo cual aquí un aspecto que hay que tener en cuenta y que se va a ver dentro del marco jurídico que está proponiendo la Comisión Europea es el acceso a los datos y la compartición de los mismos. Y por último, pero no menos importante, es la rapidez con que evoluciona todo el entorno en el que nos estamos moviendo. De ahí que todo marco normativo que se está viendo ahora, que estamos trabajando, nosotros también estamos trabajando, como en el marco del Comité Económico y Social Europeo, ese marco normativo, primero, tiene que ser predecible, tiene que ser suficientemente flexible para que favorezca y permita la evolución tecnológica asociada al mismo, porque si no, no nos podemos quedar atrás. Es decir, ya está Europa atrás, entonces no nos podemos quedar atrás. Entonces son esos, porque estamos hablando de ecosistemas industriales que trascienden, estoy pensando en la automoción, por poner un ejemplo que nos viene a todos a la cabeza, que trasciende la noción de sector tradicionalmente considerado. Por último, ¿qué podemos hacer? Uno, hay dos niveles. Uno a nivel de la empresa, es decir, nosotros también tenemos nuestras responsabilidades para favorecer la integración de estas tecnologías. Y aquí la primera pregunta que nos tenemos que hacer es, primero, conocer la inteligencia artificial, qué es lo que nos puede favorecer y si es la mejor tecnología que podemos ajustar. Si contamos con los datos que necesitamos y, sobre todo, y luego con la tercera hay más, pero una de las terceras es si contamos con las habilidades dentro del equipo y las capacidades necesarias para escalar, para introducirlo y escalar, ¿vale?, esta funcionalidad. Eso con respecto a nosotros, a las pymes, micro y pymes. Con respecto a las prácticas políticas públicas, lo que estamos pidiendo. Primero, lo que necesitamos es un entorno lo más predecible y con la mayor seguridad jurídica posible, teniendo en cuenta que no podemos, si me permitís la expresión en español, poner puertas al campo. Tenemos que generar condiciones de competencia equitativas con los players que tenemos ahora mismo, pero además favoreciendo la entrada de otros nuevos en el mercado con unas condiciones de competencia lo más justas posibles para todos ellos. En tercer lugar, ampliar la formación. En segundo lugar, la formación y la educación en competencias digitales es absolutamente crucial para todos los sectores, tanto la administración pública como a nivel empresarial. Y, en tercer lugar, reducir la fragmentación del mercado interior europeo. Tenemos que trabajar en la integración del mercado interior porque es la base de nuestra ventaja competitiva como Unión Europea frente a Estados Unidos, pero también China. Entonces, bueno, estas son nuestras consideraciones que dejamos encima de la mesa como reflexiones y, por supuesto, para terminar, se ha mencionado los valores europeos y que tener el ser humano en el centro, no podemos estar más de acuerdo. La cuestión es que entre todos hagamos un entorno competitivo donde las empresas europeas y que puedan entrar también en el mercado europeo con las condiciones de las que nos dotemos, bueno, pues generar mayores oportunidades de empleo y ofertar mejores productos y servicios para nuestros clientes, que es lo que importa. Muchísimas gracias. No sé si...
Thank you very, very much. This was extremely useful for our work. It's good to know how small and medium-sized companies are thinking in terms of AI and where the barriers are, but also opportunities, because we need also to remember that there are some benefits with using AI. But when we're talking about tackling market concentration, I very often hear, the argument that if we want to try to regulate the big companies in order to make sure that we have a more fair competition and market dominance should not be too big, then I very often get the argument back, if I do that too much, I compromise the small and medium-sized companies' ability to compete because innovation will be hampered if we have too much regulation and things like that. What is your opinion on that? Is it true that if we regulate too much, the big ones, it has a negative impact on the smaller ones as well?
This one, yes. I mean, the thing is to have the smarter regulation possible in the European Union. Why? Because the small and medium companies, micro, small, and also medium companies relies on these big technologies just to put their products on the market. I mean, this is a reality. And at the same time, we have to make sure that more and more companies, and that's why it's so important to create the framework conditions for the European startup ecosystem, in the sense that more companies are able to offer the same services. But if you look at the market, at the way you can reach out millions or billions of clients, do you have Facebook? Do you have all these companies? So we don't have to deny or to demonize any company. Well, we have to make sure that the behavior in the market is transparent, is open, and favors the interests of new players. And these new players can play the game in the same condition, as much as possible in the same condition as the previous one. So that's the virtuous circle. But of course, you have to bear in mind that we are talking about ecosystem on this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I know it's complicated and we need to find the right balances, but sometimes, when we're talking about banks, we always talk about making sure that they are not too big to fail, because that's not good. Maybe we should talk on tech companies that they might be too big to touch, because when they have this big size, then they are so important for smaller companies in order to reach their customers, that if we try to regulate them, we might even hamper, the competition of the smaller ones. And this is important for us to try to find our ways through that, so that we still do what we need to do in terms of making sure that we can tackle the market concentration. Thank you very, very much, Patricia. It was a pleasure having you here. And then I will move directly to the next one. This is Augustin Reiner from BEOC, the European Consumer Organization, and I've been a member of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committees all my 15 years here in the Parliament, and BEOC has been one of the most important organizations that I've been working together with. I always welcome their inputs to our work, and I always trust their good advices. So I'm also looking very much forward to listen to the presentation today. So I have two screens here. I just want to that one. Okay, but I am happy to be able to welcome Augustin Reiner from BEOC, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Schaldemose, also for your extremely kind words about BEOC. I think I have a couple of slides, if the colleagues of the Secretariat can put them forward. In the meantime, I can just highlight that I'm, of course, going to speak from a consumer perspective and how market concentration and monopolization practices can affect the development of consumer-facing AI markets. Next slide, please. Elena already discussed about the question of market capitalization as a proxy of market power. What I can add is a fact that is known to all of us, is that the tech sector is one of the most concentrated industries, dominated by companies from the US and China mainly. We can have, of course, we should have a very important geopolitical discussion about this, but in what concerns the impact on EU markets, we can draw two conclusions. The first conclusion is that innovation in the area of AI will be dictated ultimately by these companies. And the second conclusion is the great dependency of different players active in this sector, both at the level of software as well as hardware. Next slide, please. So one, of course, needs to wonder what makes these companies so powerful. Innovation is certainly one of these factors, but we can also identify other elements, such as gatekeeping power, in which these companies serve as infrastructure for digital markets, and many other companies, especially startups, as mentioned by the previous speaker, but also bigger companies, depend on these players in order to develop their products and provide services to consumers. At the same time, we have identified leveraging strategies in which through integrated vertical services, these companies can leverage their power that they have in one market into other markets and therefore continue expanding. Data concentration has also been an extremely important factor. In the words of Google's chief scientist, Peter Novick, who acknowledged, and I quote, "We don't have better algorithms than anyone else. We just have more data." And this actually highlights the importance of having access to data for AI systems. At the same time, we have seen throughout the decades, and also because of how merger control has been structured and reshaped over the years, and Helena already talked about this, increasing level of acquisition by these companies, both at the level of technology acquisitions, some call them reverse killer acquisitions, as well as killer acquisition in order to suppress competition or potential competition, and therefore continue consolidating their market power. Next slide, please. If we look more concretely at what are the barriers for entry and expansion in AI markets or IoT markets, we can also refer to that. It is extremely interesting the work that having been carried out by the European Commission Competition Directorate in its IoT sector inquiry, which has identified as top barriers to entry and expansion, question of investment, certainly as in many other industries, but as well the competitive situation in which very few companies are controlling key markets like voice assistants, but as well interoperability or lack of interoperability, access to data, and IP intellectual property rights barriers. Next slide, please. And that's, of course, raised several competition concerns. If we think of interoperability and integration processes, we cannot forget that interoperability is mainly based on agreements offered by the incumbent, and in this type of relationship, many of the platforms or the other companies that need to interoperate with this incumbent lack the bargaining power to negotiate the terms. And that, of course, has an impact on the on the functionality of third-party products and services, since the interoperability and integration processes are defined by the incumbent company. Standardization processes as well, we cannot forget that these leading players are the ones that are setting their standards, and also that makes it much more difficult and complicated for rivals to compete with proprietary technologies of these leading companies. As mentioned before, we have leveraging data advantages or data that no other company can replicate. And we have seen that, for example, in several cases, both at the level of antitrust and merger control, thinking more recently on the Google Fitbit acquisition. The controlling of the user interface, this is extremely important from a consumer perspective. And here we have situation of pre-installations and the use of defaults, basically to steer consumers and make consumers stick with the services provided by the incumbent platform, as well as tying practices. So these are just few examples of competition concerns that could be addressed by both by means of legislation or antitrust enforcement. Next slide, please. I would like to highlight an extremely important provision in the recently proposed AI Act by the European Commission, in which the national supervisory authorities that will have power over the supervision of these technologies is required, and this is an obligation which is extremely important, to inform the European Commission or the relevant national competition authorities about any information or data that might be relevant to the application of union law on competition law. So this is extremely important both to break up enforcement silos, but at the same time to contribute to a better enforcement of competition laws. Next slide, please. And then my last points relates to the Digital Markets Act. Here, as you all know very well, we're talking about asymmetric legislation to target gatekeeping power. It follows a different approach to competition law, and we would like to stress that here we are in the field of regulation. This is not competition law, even if they might share similar objectives. And what we have identified is that there are several obligations, including Article 5 and 6 of the Commission proposal, which are relevant for artificial intelligence, and this includes related, for example, to the issue of access and aggregation of data, restrictions on the combination of end users, so consumers, data subjects data, and of business users when the data of the business users is not publicly available, time as well, ranking obligations, data portability, which this goes also hand by hand with the GDPR, data portability rights for data subjects, as well as what the Commission will propose in the new Data Act. Interoperability, extremely important. I know that Chris Marsden is going to speak about it, so I'm not going to go any further on this. And access to data. All these obligations, as we know, are under scrutiny now by the European Parliament and the Member States and the Council. So, of course, many of these might change, but it will be extremely important also to keep in mind the relevance of this obligation for artificial intelligence. And that's my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention and for the invitation again.
Thank you very much for bringing us closer to the concrete regulation we are working with here in the Parliament on DMA and AI, and it's always good to get help to see where the loopholes are in the proposals that the Commission has tabled. So thank you very much for that. Since the time is running, I will immediately thank you very much, Agustin Reiner, and I will immediately go to the next speaker. Unfortunately, I think that we have too little time, but that's how it is. So I will immediately go to the next speaker and invite Professor Chris Marsden from University of Sussex and Professor of Media Law to come in and make his presentation. And I do think that the media landscape is also affected by the changes and the big tech giant, and it is extremely important because it's just not affect the business model of the media landscape, but it also will have an impact on democracy. And therefore, I'm looking very much forward to hearing your presentation. So, Professor Marsden, the floor is yours, and very warm welcome.
Mr. Marsden, you may click on the speak button. If that is not possible, please change to a different browser. Thank you.
Okay, the giant speak button has been pressed. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. Can we have the first slide, please? And there's a slide presentation there. Great. So Agustin actually trailed this, and again, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk about interoperability, and it's really because of a very long and rather tragic history that we have in competition law in Europe of taking 10, 15 years to actually solve some of the problems that we've had. We have already had mention of the Microsoft saga, which in the end ran on for yes, almost 15 years. I'm going to talk about interoperability as a potential way of dealing with solving some of these problems. A lot of the proposals we've heard so far have actually been about actually understanding the nature of the problem and some of the ingredients in the problem. I'm going to try and talk about some of the solutions. A lot of the work that I'm doing here is built on work that I've done with Professor Ian Brown, who some of you will know, a computer scientist who's worked on this issue and also many other issues with me across the years. And so I'll talk about that. Next slide, please. So regulating code is actually the kind of the masterwork that Ian and I have been engaged in, and we're particularly interested in artificial intelligence because of the risks that, as the chair said, it poses to some of the democratic processes that we have. And so we've done a lot of work on election cybersecurity and political disinformation. I'm speaking to you, of course, from the University of Sussex, which is just outside Brighton, which is, I hope, the most European of English cities. And of course, we've recently had the experience with Brexit and with other things. So we produced some reports for the European Parliament in 2019. That was with Tricia Meyer from the Free University of Brussels. and also for the Commonwealth, which encompasses nations including India and Pakistan and South Africa and many other democracies with very large scale processes and very large scale problems with the uses of online political advertising. And that's a summary of our arguments for you to go to afterwards. Next slide, please. I should say that the work I'm doing is now contained within the research node for the UK on AI research called Trusted Autonomous Systems, and I work within the governance and regulation pillar, again looking particularly at the future of AI regulation, and we're focusing, even though we may have left the European Union, very much on the Artificial Intelligence Act and its enforcement. And the enforcement is very important, I think, and I know that obviously the politicians dealing with the Act are aware of the need for this to be more than just a signposting of Europe is doing something, and to think about the enforcement that takes place afterwards, which Augustine also talked about as well. So on to the next slide, please. The worry, of course, is that we're moving into a world where we're accepting the use of technologies in our day-to-day life, which we would never have accepted had they been imposed on us from above. And whether we're peering into our iPhone or looking into our Microsoft or Apple laptop and using our browser, which, as the technical assistant said, was actually Firefox, which actually works rather well. We need to be aware of the technologies we're using and the way in which they're being intermediated by machine learning, which all, of course, is becoming bounded by this term artificial intelligence, which is not always true, as I think Professor Bryson will talk about later on. Next slide, please. So we're in a rather difficult situation where we have the largest companies dealing with information in this space not necessarily being entirely cooperative, to put it mildly, with legislative authorities. And this is a letter that you will see that was sent from Facebook in response to questions about the way in which Facebook was managing political advertising regulation. Not hugely comprehensive, and a fairly dramatic rebuttal, you might say, of inquiries from Congress. And that particularly becomes important because of the next slide. And the next slide is, of course, the famous incident last week when Facebook was down, unfortunately, for about 5.5 hours. It was Facebook and WhatsApp, its property for instant messaging, and Instagram. I don't know what the situation was in Brussels, but political activity in London more or less ground to a halt, because it turned out that most of the politicians relied upon their WhatsApp groups for much of their discussion of political activities. It was, in fact, a technical screw-up. But it's worth saying that the technical screw-up would have been much less bad had we had interoperability between the Facebook properties and other apps. I'm not saying that the other apps necessarily would want to interoperate with them, but it would have at least provided people with an alternative platform. And there is no evidence, of course, although we've just conducted a natural experiment, in whether this has done anything about Instagram underage users and their mental health, which we know has been a huge concern in the US Congress. It's also worth saying, of course, that when we do have one of these giant platforms going down, it may be a cause for comment and gossip in Brussels and in London, but of course it's hugely influential in countries where WhatsApp is relied upon much more. And I'm thinking specifically of countries like Brazil and South Africa, where you use WhatsApp for lots of activities, including authorizing payments, amongst other things. So this was really a critical, disastrous situation for people in countries where the infrastructure relies upon these in a very, very strong way. I should add one more point, by the way, which is that I've given evidence to the European Parliament in the past about network neutrality, which was a saga that went on for about a decade before we got some kind of enforcement through BEREC and through the national regulators. And just to say, that's another issue area where the ability to achieve interoperability solves a lot of the problems that we have. So let's go to the next slide, please. In very simple terms, I know that Professor Bryson won't agree with me on this, and it's a shame we're not on the same panel, because we could have had, I think, probably quite a spirited debate. What do we need? Well, interoperability in very crude terms could look like email. It fixes Facebook down because it means that you can communicate using other platforms. It gives you interoperability, and not just interoperability with Instagram and WhatsApp. Mark Zuckerberg already has plans for interoperability between the messaging services on Facebook Messenger, on Instagram, and on WhatsApp. And why not allow it to be done by everybody else as well? It's not something that, as I say, all apps would want. I know, I for instance, am a Signal user. I know Signal would not want to interoperate necessarily with these platforms. It would claim that its security protocols are much more effective than theirs are. But why not allow you to interoperate with Google, with FaceTime, with LinkedIn and Skype? And I realize I'm mentioning properties here which are, of course, belonging to the other GAFAM players. And I could also throw Amazon in there as well. It would help them to interoperate with each other. It would help the rest of us to possibly arrive at an alternative platform that we might find even more effective, if that's our wish. And so it is a way that we could actually achieve consumer switching across from these dominant platforms, as well, of course, as within these dominant platforms. I'm not going to say it's a silver bullet or some kind of magic solution, because interoperability only offers an opportunity for markets to change. It doesn't offer necessarily any kind of guarantee of that. And again, recalling the Microsoft saga, the outcome of the Microsoft saga to some extent was the fact that, of course, Google Chrome replaces Edge as the dominant browser, and that may not have been what we might have predicted would happen at the beginning of the saga. So let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, I would go through the details of the AI Act, but they're very familiar, I'm sure, to the chair and to others. So just to say that I will flag up this paper from the Open Knowledge Foundation, OFA paper, Interoperability as a Tool for Competition Regulation. It's written by Professor Ian Brown. I reviewed, but I didn't have direct input. But I would recommend this as a way for you to advance the discussion, because apart from anything else, I think that there is a reluctance by some, particularly in DG competition, to pursue interoperability. I don't know whether that's because of a lack of faith in its feasibility, whether it's because of the prior experience of interoperability producing perhaps less competitive outcomes than they would have wished, or whether it's simply because it doesn't provide a quick win within the current mandate of the Commission. I wouldn't suggest that anyone would be so political and crude as to suggest that. But I think that it really is a remedy that we should look at, and a remedy which is much more effective than any amount of monetary fines, and also a remedy which, if we write it into the, in particular into the Digital Markets Act, we do actually start to achieve solutions to the problems that are identified by other speakers in a way that doesn't rely upon a 10 or 15-year competition law saga, which will take us into the 2030s. I think the chair would agree we don't want to wait until the 2030s to get some kind of movement on having a pro-competitive remedy in this situation. So there we are. I hope that was helpful. And apologies for the radio silence at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Professor Marsden, and no worries, we got your message, and I have to say to you that I completely agree. We will not wait until 2030. Maybe I can, show some signs of optimism when it comes to interoperability, because we are already working with that here in the European Parliament in both DSA and DMA. And there is a huge interest and a huge support in EP for making it obligatory to have this interoperability between services. I like your universal SOME address and things like that. So I think that will come from the European Parliament's position in these two pieces of legislation. And then I hope that we will be able to convince the Council. That might be a little bit more tricky. On the other hand, I think we should not accept anything less than interoperability in the future. The second thing you're touching upon is enforcement. I completely agree. We really need to do something. We have a focus on it, I have to say, even though it's difficult. There is a tendency that we say, well, enforcement, we come up with a lot of demands, but then the Council and the Member States say, well, it's their territory, it's up to them, and we should not really touch upon it, and they decide, how it works. But we have a focus on it, and that's because we know that if we don't solve that at the same time, it doesn't matter. So thank you very much for your many good comments, and I really liked your Huxley quote, and I will use that myself. I really like that. We are, at least to a certain extent, moving in that direction. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. And then I will move directly to the last speaker on my list. That is, I just have to close my phone here, and that is Isabella Schumann from ETUC. And it's always important for us here in our group to have the social partners on board when we talk about these questions and how we regulate things that will have an impact on the working force and on the society in general. And therefore, it's a huge pleasure for me to invite Isabella Schumann to take the floor and present the point of view from ETUC. You are the Confederal Secretary, so I always tend to forget people's title, but now I got it with you. Please, Isabel, welcome very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Crystal, and very happy to be with you today. I think it's very important, and I will not reinvent the wheel, not repeat what some of the colleagues before me have said, but I would like to make certain points that have been forgotten still in the discussion so far. Of course, it's about technology neutrality, and I think this is one very important aspect. It has been developed around the issue of interoperability in terms of the access to data, in terms of the access to digital services. Cybersecurity has not been mentioned. I think this is also another dimension we have to take on board. The second is, of course, to secure that we are moving towards preventing unfair competitions. And I think this is, of course, what we've been seeing so far is that competition has led to the increase of inequalities, in particular to access. And I think my colleague from the consumer organizations has quite well developed the issue of those inequality. And I think we can also speak about the loss of control of those businesses that are using what I call the new gold, which is data. And I think it all boils down indeed to the issue of data. And this is the reasons why it is very important that we look into the review of competition policies, and it is something which is ongoing, not just for the sake of reviewing those competition policy measures, but also, and in particular, because it is very important that competition policy does not develop in a silo. And here, of course, it has to take on board the impact of the decisions of such policies on other policy areas. We understood consumers are quite well in the forefront, but workers are missing. And here, this is something that we have identified throughout, I would say, the discussions on competition policy, likewise on the AI, and this is one of the I would say, conjunctions that we can see here, and for which I will really plead and alert you about this very missing element that cannot be, in particular because any European legislations and actions and initiatives had to take on board and to have as a compass, again, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. And I think this is competition policies are not an exemption, nor AI working or being developed in the field of internal market legislation. So I think here my plea is here to bring the dimension back to the reality, and of course to look into the dimension of AI/competition policy and its impact at the workplace. And of course here the fact that we have to see that fundamental rights are the basis on which all those digital business have to be regulated. And here again, I think we have missed back in time the opportunity to regulate them, and we should do so in the future. When it comes to data, when it comes to data protection, and in particular when it comes to the use of data at the workplace. And of course, it is much more, and it should be much more along the line of the Charter, but also the political declarations that the European institutions, together with the member states, have agreed upon in 2017 and reiterated this year around the pillar of social rights. So here I think the objective of Social Europe should be put also in the discussions, and AI should remain compatible with those objectives. And here we are speaking about decent work, social progress, and we are also speaking about inclusive governance, and in particular the need for workers' representative and trade unions to be informed and consulted when AI is established and developed at the workplace. But when we come back to the issue of competition policy, what we do see here is exactly that, and it has been mentioned with reference to studies. We are looking at the impact on consumer, but this is not the only group that has access and that has to work with AI in the workplace. And I think here employers, likewise workers, have to be taken into considerations when you look at the theory of harm, and in particular when you look at the impact of market dominance. Why? Because here what we see, and that it is unacceptable in the European Union, is that labor is becoming a commodity, and that the data of labor is the commodity by which labor is turned into a commodity. And it's all about efficiency. We understood it's all about profit, but it is not the main dimensions that the European Union should follow. And you know very well that after the pandemic and the abuse, and I must say, unfortunately, abuse of tracking measures of management by algorithm, there are here red lines that have been crossed, and in particular those related to human rights and those related to workers' rights in terms of access to data, not respecting their consent. And I even go so far that some businesses find that quite attractive to buy the private data of workers and to use them as an asset. This is something we see developing in the US, and this is something that some employers in the European Union find attractive. And I think this is a no-go in the European Union, exactly because those business models are not aligned with the fundamentals of the European Union, which are indeed found in the treaties, but in particular in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. And I recall this one is legally binding for all institutions and member states in their actions, initiative, and legal initiative. What we have to see also is that we find ways to regulate AI and to regulate competitions in a way that indeed we move into more transparency and more liability for business, and in particular those online business and online platform. And we need to track and stop their unfair practices. And what we see here, that we cannot accept that there is a kind of dominance of those practices of fundamental rights, and human rights here should not be put in competition with market forces, so to say. It is very important that we find ways to regulate. We have the treaty, of course, but we also have secondary legislations, and the DSA, DMA have been put into the discussions. And I think here this is where we need to make sure that the DSA and the DMA package puts people back in the charge, and that we end surveillance for profit and algorithms that amplify disinformation and discrimination. And we have also to make sure that we recognize the danger, not just the innovation potential, but danger around the move towards AI, and in particular to have innovation at any price. And I think this is something also after the pandemic that we cannot afford. What we do see is unfortunately that it is not the case. So we have different initiatives on the table. DSA DMA is one of them. Platform is another one where we have missed back in time to recognize platform as businesses. So platform are developing without being recognized as businesses, nor as employers. And I think here we do see the very damaging impact that has those practices and business model in the society. And I think here, recalling the International Day of Decent Work last week, I think it is clear that this is not a good example, and this is the reasons why it is very important that competition policy, likewise internal markets, and I would say DG Justice look at those platform and recognize them as employer and businesses. Likewise, when we have the discussions now on the condition, the working condition around what platforms are providing, what we do see here is the abuse of algorithm by management by algorithm, which does lead to circumventing European legislations and national legislation at the member states level, and it can't be indeed that we accept that those businesses determine their own conditions and conduct in the market, and in this respect are have no problem to abuse existing system. Now, when it comes to the draft AI regulation. And here we do also see that the reference to the workplace is very weak, and there is here hardly any reference that would make it that would make the difference in terms of using AI for the workplace. And here again, we have clearly seen that there is a need for addressing the specificity of the workplace, in particular because AI use and impact does not end in the hand of employers, but reach out to the workers, reach out to the individual in the workplace, where we do see that there is a real imbalance in terms of the power between employers and employees. And it is also very important for us that indeed here, when it comes to the workplace, reference is made to an inclusive governance whereby workers, representative and trade unions are informed and consulted and participate to these decision processes, so that we first of all respect EU legislation in terms of workers' participations. Second, that we make sure that those human rights, including trade union rights, are respected. And that we make also these innovations deliver for all and not just for some big business out there, delivered for all, so that at the end, the very important, crucial and inevitable digital transformations delivers for all, and also is give an empowerment to the workers indeed to move on with these transformations. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Isabella Schumann. Yes, it's true that we need always to make sure that we first and foremost comply with the EU regulation. Therefore, there is a responsibility to bring in workers and social partners in what we do when we work with these questions. And I do also believe that for the companies, it is beneficial for them that they bring the perspectives of the workers in. Having said that, I also think that we need to, maybe also consider the benefits, the upside of using new technology. Don't misunderstand me. I agree with you to a very large extent on all the difficulties and problems and issues we already have on the table today and see. But don't you also see some good sides? The trade unions in my country, Denmark, they tend to be very, very keen on digitalization. They want to use AI more because they believe that that's the way to keep the companies in Denmark. And if I could transform it into a European context, that they see it as a way to keep companies in Europe instead of moving them to another part of the world where they produce. So is there, in your opinion, a way to make sure that we see both the negative, of course, and focus on that and make sure that we have good legislation and use the one we have, but also remember the positive side of the new technology? Or am I too positive in your opinion? Isabel?
We want to pay, but of course we want to have
Isabel, we didn't really hear you. There was some kind of
didn't push the button.
Okay. No, but now we hear you.
I'm totally with you, but what I wanted to say is that of course we are for innovations, for digital innovations. We are driving digital innovation. You mentioned Denmark, and I can mention likewise examples throughout the training movement throughout Europe, but not at any price. And not certainly not at the price of human beings and workers, not at the price of making labor a commodity. And I think this is exactly the red lines we do not want to cross. And this is exactly where we do see the specificity of the European Union, to keep big businesses here, but good big businesses, and not to buy to any kind of business model that would come from outside and think Europe is the next place to invest, but on their conditions, not on our conditions. And I think here, competition policy, likewise internal market legislations, has a lot of potentials to allow the entry into the internal market or not to allow the entry into the internal market, and to allow it on the basis of our values, not on the basis of the lowest price for leading to slavery. So this is also what we see in certain sectors. So yes, innovations, yes, digital innovations that should deliver for all, not just for big businesses, on the condition of the European Union values and principles.
Thank you so much. And of course, I agree that we have seen some misuse, or maybe even to a large extent misuse of workers, and we really need to be aware of that and do something to prevent that. And at the same time, also use the good opportunities and the flexibilities and new options that the digitalization delivers for us. Colleagues, and speakers, thank you so much for attending this first panel on how we tackle the market concentration. It has been inspiring for me, and I got a lot of new ideas, even though I have been working with this for some time. So I really appreciate it, and I know that the colleagues who listened in see it in the same way. So we really appreciate your presence here today and your presentations. A big thanks from my side. And also here, I will thank all the participants from my side, and I will step down and invite the next moderator for the next panel to take the podium. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the seminar.
Okay, empty room, but hopefully people behind the screens as we are used to. My name is Mia-Petra Kumpula-Natri, member of the European Parliament here from Finland, but now I arrived in Brussels, and I'm very happy to chair this part of the seminar. So panel 2, promoting technological diversification. So the topic introduction. It's increasingly clear that the current state of affairs in the digital economy is not sustainable. A new wave of the technology is centered on openness and decentralization, collectively referred to as the Web 3.0, might be showing a way forward. The EU single market is at its best when there is a diversity of companies competing for the customers. This is not how our tech platforms look today. The question we all should be asking ourselves is that we cannot promote innovation and diversification in this sector. In the Data Governance Act, we aim at setting up the new European way of data governance in order to facilitate data sharing across the sectors and member states, which would provide control to citizens and trust to companies, also SMEs. We also insist to have a reference to common European data spaces to create linkages to the data strategy INI report and establish a clear rules to open and fair data economy. We are strongly pushing for the setting down the guidelines for fair data economy, including interoperability, ensuring level playing field, and adequate representation of the relevant stakeholders. New legislation such as DSA and the DMA will ensure the creation of fertile environment for the emergence of new business opportunities, and in particular for SMEs and startups, the promotion of the challenging and favorable context for innovation, and the facilitation of cross-border trade relations. So how can we as regulators support researchers, innovators, and engineers working on the new open alternatives to the dominant tech platforms? I do have an honor to ask the following speakers to the second panel. And we will start with the Paul Nemitz from European Commission, who is the principal advisor also for the DG Just. So Paul Nemitz, please.
We're still trying to contact him. He is not online.
Okay. Yes, it seems there are some technical challenges with Paul Nemitz to be connected, so we can move to the next speaker and have Paul's intervention later, I hope. So next on the list is Manuel G. Bedia, a Spanish Ministry of Universities, and she's a professor at the University of Zaragoza. Please, if we get Manuel online, and I see already the presentation is there. Manuel, do we have a contact?
Please activate your webcam. We can see and hear you.
Now it looks good.
Yeah, hello?
Yes, we do hear you. Please, Mr. Bedia.
Thank you. My presentation is ready?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm very grateful to have been invited and to speak about thematic diversity in current artificial intelligence. It has been explained to me that I may give my presentation in my mother tongue, so I'm switching the language and I will explain my ideas in Spanish, if you don't mind. El tema del estrechamiento de la diversidad temática en la actual inteligencia artificial es algo que me parece esencial y he preparado una presentación con varias ideas donde me gustaría seguir el siguiente esquema. Mostrar cómo históricamente la tecnología que se impone, la tecnología dominante, no es siempre la mejor. Presentar los problemas actuales que tiene la tecnología de inteligencia artificial que domina actualmente y referencia a los trabajos, que son pocos, que se han hecho para medir la evolución de la diversidad temática en inteligencia artificial y la idea de que esto sirva como sugerencias para los gestores de políticas públicas. Next slide, please. Yeah. Bueno, la idea es contextualizar el análisis en el marco de lo que se llama la economía evolutiva y de los modelos de cambio técnico, que estudian cómo el comportamiento económico tiene mucha relación con la innovación y con los cambios tecnológicos. Este marco económico, este marco teórico, propone que las tecnologías que se vuelven dominantes normalmente lo hacen por azares, por contextos coyunturales, no necesariamente son las mejores tecnologías desde el punto de vista técnico. En algunos aspectos pueden ser mejores, pero en otras son defectuosas. Pero hay aspectos sociales, culturales, que hacen que se impongan sobre las demás y luego efectos de uso, de escala, que hacen que se mantengan, ¿no? Y la idea, por tanto, es que potencialmente existen muchas trayectorias tecnológicas y la situación social e histórica se decanta por una. No siempre es, como digo, la que técnicamente es la más avanzada. En la actualidad tenemos que la que se ha impuesto, y no ha sido siempre así en la historia de la inteligencia artificial, es el Machine Learning, en concreto lo que se llama el Deep Learning, que es métodos estadísticos para extraer patrones en grandes bases de datos. Next slide, please. Bueno, ¿cuáles son las características de esta tecnología de inteligencia artificial que tenemos actualmente? Bueno, tienen unas exigencias muy grandes, requieren grandes bases de datos, inmensas bases de datos, no son particularmente aceptables para todos los campos, pero sí, por ejemplo, para el tratamiento de imágenes, de vídeo, de audio, de texto, información no estructurada. Son frágiles en el sentido de que por mucho que aprendan, pocos casos pueden hacer que olviden lo aprendido, ¿no? Y que tengamos ahora en la actualidad estas tecnologías depende mucho de la inversión que han hecho las grandes compañías privadas como Google, DeepMind, Facebook, Microsoft. Estas empresas que viven de los datos y que han hecho toda una apuesta por economía de datos, pues son las que más han influido tanto en el desarrollo tecnológico como en el teórico. Pero como digo, estas tecnologías que funcionan muy bien en unos campos tienen problemas para ser explicada la razón por la que funcionan. No son tecnologías robustas, son muy sensibles a casos poco particulares y además, bueno, se han desarrollado fundamentalmente en ámbitos comerciales, ¿no? Next slide. La idea es que existe la percepción de que estos riesgos son mayores si tenemos el sector privado liderando el ámbito de la inteligencia artificial. Básicamente porque las empresas quieren ir muy rápido para sobreponerse a los competidores, también porque se centran exclusivamente en objetivos comerciales, abandonando quizá otras áreas de interés, y como veremos, porque tienden a reclutar personal del sector público académico, creando el riesgo de que converja la investigación que se hace tanto pública como privada en pocas alternativas, ¿no? La cuestión es si esto, que tiene implicaciones políticas, porque podemos estar desarrollando tecnología que no proteja el beneficio colectivo o que reduzca el coste, o sea, aumente el coste de cambio si hay que cambiar de tecnología, o que vayamos a bloqueos prematuros de trayectorias tecnológicas. Si esto, que tiene un carácter, por tanto, político, debemos intervenir y cómo. Y para eso, la idea, esto es una descripción cualitativa, la idea es medir cómo ha aumentado o se ha reducido la diversidad en los últimos años, ¿no? Para medirlo, el primer trabajo al que he tomado de referencia es este de aquí, es un trabajo de Ismael Rafols y Martin Meyer, donde determinan cómo poder medir la diversidad en términos de 3 elementos. La variedad de los temas que se abordan, es decir, el número de categorías, de topics diferentes, el balance, es decir, la distribución de ese número de categorías, si se distribuyen en muy pocas o en muchas, si están más o menos concentradas, si hay asimetría o si hay balance, y la disparidad, que mide hasta qué punto esas categorías son distintas o son similares, ¿no? Ese es el primer trabajo. El segundo trabajo, en ese slide, es un trabajo de Juan Mateos, el director de la Unidad de Diseño de Políticas de Innovación Nesta, que han hecho un trabajo cuantitativo, empírico, para medir cómo ha evolucionado esta diversidad en los últimos años en inteligencia artificial, midiendo cómo ha sido la evolución, cómo ha influido el sector privado y cómo ha afectado el sector privado al sector público, ¿no? Lo que hacen es, en una base de datos Archive de 1,5 millones de papers, extraer aquellos que tienen que ver con inteligencia artificial, son 115.000, y clasificar automáticamente en los topics que se pueden extraer, 557. Y ahora se mide cómo están esos topics relacionados entre sí y se puede ver en el tiempo cómo han evolucionado. Next slide, please. La idea es que... sí, siguiente slide. Sí. Hay tres grandes conclusiones de este trabajo que son muy relevantes. La primera es cómo ha evolucionado la diversidad en la inteligencia artificial. Bueno, se ve que ha crecido exponencialmente el número de contribuciones científicas y de desarrollos tecnológicos que son publicados en esta base de datos, que, como digo, no es una base de datos solo de papers, solo de publicaciones científicas, sino de difusión industrial, ¿no? Tanto es así que el 20% ya de los trabajos que están publicados tienen que ver con inteligencia artificial. Hay medidas también muy interesantes, como por ejemplo el 90% de todos los trabajos de inteligencia artificial en esta base de datos, el 90% están concentrados desde 2018. Es decir, ha habido un crecimiento exponencial, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista de la composición, se puede ver cómo a lo largo del tiempo ha ido estrechándose el número de ámbitos y se ha concentrado básicamente en esos que se señalan ahí: Computer Vision, Learning and Language, el tratamiento del lenguaje. Y cuando se hacen trabajos de diversidad temática, es decir, análisis de cómo se ha reducido esta diversidad, se ve que o se ha asentado o recientemente ha declinado. Y esto es más paradójico en un momento de crecimiento de la actividad, donde cuando crece la actividad de un área, pues se crean nuevas oportunidades, nuevas expectativas y normalmente se crece en diversidad. Siguiente slide, please. El siguiente resultado tiene que ver con la participación de las compañías privadas. Se hace un análisis concreto sobre las compañías privadas y se ve que cada vez el nivel de participación, y no solo de participación, sino de influencia de las compañías privadas en el desarrollo de la IA es mayor. Ahora mismo, en el 15, casi el 20% de los trabajos científicos que se publicaron en 2020, había una compañía privada como autora o coautora. Y la influencia es que si tomamos aquellos trabajos, los 100 trabajos más citados, en el 50% al menos hay ya una compañía privada. Si miramos exclusivamente cuál es el espectro de trabajo de las compañías privadas, se ve que se han especializado en el deep learning, en este tipo de técnicas estadísticas, en los topics que hemos dicho antes, lenguaje, visión, imágenes, y también en el desarrollo de computación a gran escala, que son un poco sus tecnologías. Pero hay otros ámbitos de interés social, como las aplicaciones médicas o éticas, que son muy minoritarias, ¿no? Y por otro lado, se puede ver en comparación que la diversidad temática de los trabajos de las compañías privadas son más estrechas que el total, que el global. Siguiente slide, please. De manera que nos queda por ver un ámbito que es la parte pública, ¿no? Pero la parte pública, ¿cómo ha evolucionado a partir de su relación con la industria? Se han producido muchos canales de comunicación, de captación de investigadores a la parte privada, y lo que se puede ver es que ahora mismo el 60% de los trabajos que hacen las compañías tienen también una institución académica, ¿no? Todas las grandes tecnologías trabajan, todas colaboran con las grandes instituciones académicas de élite, las grandes universidades de élite. Si miramos además cómo ha cambiado la diversidad desde el punto de vista académico, observamos que la propia agenda académica ha girado imitando cuáles son las prioridades de la industria a partir de estos modelos de colaboración. Con lo cual, lo que se ha producido no solo es un estrechamiento de la diversidad porque la industria tiene mucho peso y tiene unos intereses más cerrados, sino porque las compañías privadas han estrechado de alguna manera también la agenda pública, aumentando la homogeneidad. Y solamente o casualmente solo las instituciones más pequeñas, es decir, aquellas que no tienen tanta colaboración industrial, están preservando de una manera global la diversidad temática porque no están tan atadas a estas, digamos, prioridades del mainstream de la vanguardia de inteligencia artificial. Next slide, please. Bueno, podríamos preguntarnos, bueno, ¿y qué ocurre si se reduce la diversidad? ¿Esto es un problema? Hay que apostar por la diversidad desde el punto de vista público, hay que hacer políticas que apoyen la diversidad. Bueno, hay trabajos históricos desde hace tiempo que consideran que es más impactante desde el punto de vista de la investigación apostar por la diversidad que por la excelencia. Es decir, generar un amplio ámbito donde se puede invertir o apoyar ideas diversas, ideas distintas, ¿no? Por varias razones. Primero, por una estrategia de portfolio. Cuantas más ideas tengamos en paralelo, menos vulnerables seremos a la incertidumbre del futuro, porque es un buen mecanismo para complementar tecnologías que son buenas para un ámbito y para otro se pueden agregar, o como mecanismo combinatorio, como mecanismo de mezcla, de hibridación, de mixtura entre tecnologías, ¿no? Con lo cual, desde el punto de vista, digamos, histórico, se conoce que la diversidad en la investigación científica es un valor. Vamos al final, a última slide. Entonces, ¿cuáles son posibles sugerencias para los policymakers, para los gestores de política pública? Si, como hemos visto, es importante apostar por la diversidad, ¿dónde se puede apostar? Bueno, una manera de apostar por la diversidad es apostar en la diversidad de los perfiles de los trabajadores, incorporando más disciplinas, más variedad cognitiva, más variedad de ámbitos de conocimiento en la educación conectados con la inteligencia artificial. También conectando diferentes tipos de diversidad, diversidad de país, de género, y generando un entorno, un fermento también mayor diverso de ideas o de enfoques, ¿no? Asegurar que reducir que el talento público se vaya a la industria, asegurando que los investigadores públicos tienen suficientes estructuras y recursos computacionales para hacer trabajo de vanguardia y de última generación. También hacer estrategias de financiación que ayuden la diversidad temática, la diversidad de ideas, apostar por misiones, tal como hace ahora la Unión Europea, para centrarse en aquellos ámbitos que para la industria no son prioritarios, como la educación, la salud, la sostenibilidad, y también investigar más en indicadores para entender mejor la diversidad. Esto era un poco lo que quería contaros. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bedia. Do you want to have a very short question, and then I will go to the next one? It's counted that it's very expensive to have this kind of a state-of-the-art model, or computing alone can stand for 12 million in open AI. So do you see that we do have enough resources, private, separated from the public, or should there be more ways to guide and support the universities' independence to choose how to guide? So this is especially for the AI sector, when doing it is not also cheap.
Sí, la evidencia es que las mejores infraestructuras los estándares que se han hecho en algoritmos vienen de la empresa privada, de manera que trabajar en el cutting edge de la investigación ahora mismo significa estar relacionado con la empresa privada, ¿no? Si no hay alternativas públicas similares, pues podemos tener efectos como este que he descrito, que trabajando con las mejores infraestructuras también adoptamos su agenda de intereses más comerciales, de ámbitos. Los desarrollos de inteligencia artificial no son fácilmente transversales. Es decir, si algo lo desarrollas para un recomendador de películas, no es fácil luego adaptarlo para un predictor oncológico. Entonces, hay áreas en las que la empresa privada no está interesada y si no tenemos alternativas públicas, pues no se va a trabajar con la misma rapidez.
Thank you. We will go further and see in the end if there's room for questions and then people to ask questions. Next speaker is Joanna. Oh, do we have a Paul Nemitz online? Or? Okay, so welcome, Paul Nemitz. Sorry for taking the next speaker before, but we wanted to save time. Good to see you, I would say personally, again. We were same seminar the other day. Welcome to the European Parliament on the screen.
Thank you very much, and I'm terribly sorry I did get into the platform, but now here I am. I hope you hear me now.
Now it's very good.
I would like to talk a little bit about the orientation to values, fundamental rights and democracy as a driver for diversity and profitability, especially in industry in Europe. And as to the question whether we can spread innovation across Europe rather than concentrating it. And I would like to refer first to a number of historical examples which show us that an early orientation towards values can be a very profitable notion, and we have seen this before the digital age, in the early orientation towards sustainable energy. So with the exit from coal, oil, and so on for electricity production, and later also the exit from atomic power in a number of member states, this is not a union policy and this is not shared by all member states, but with this exit in some member states also from atomic power, and earlier on certainly an exit strategy, an announced exit strategy from those forms of energy which have serious climate impacts, a whole new industry was created. And not only was a new industry created in terms of sun energy and other forms of wind energy and sustainable energy productions in different forms. There was also something which in American press was famously described as the greening of GE, General Electric, at the time one of the giants of American industry. So even American companies understood after initial resistance that greening can bring a lot of advantages and profitability. And it is probably fair to say that this orientation towards sustainability as a value is something which continues to inspire entrepreneurs to make enormous profits, but also policymakers. You may have remarked that in the German election campaign, one of the winning points of the Social Democratic Chancellor candidate, Olaf Scholz, was the vision of Germany becoming a leader in those technologies which are necessary for a radical turn ways of production, ways of mobility to sustainability in order to maintain Germany in its classic position as an industrial heartland of Europe, with the respective employment connected to it. And if we take this example, we can move on to another example where this example already played an important role, signified by the sentence that privacy and data protection is the new green. What is meant by this sentence? In the discussion on data protection and privacy, fundamental rights in the Charter of European Fundamental Rights and also in the European Convention on Human Rights, this parallel was often drawn that imposing strict rules on data protection and privacy will become a new driver for innovation, like the exit from coal, oil, and later atomic energy was a driver for innovation for sustainability. So the rules on data protection would be a driver for new ways of dealing with personal data. For example, privacy and data protection by design and by default, and merging in a new innovative way productivity increases and digital models with a respect for the informational self-determination of individuals. And again, I would say this prediction made around 10 years ago, when we started to reflect on the reform of data protection legislation in Europe, has turned out to be true. And the unfortunate truth is that the leaders in making data protection and privacy claims, I'm not saying it's a reality, but claims, a key marketing argument for their products, have actually been some of the market leaders in digital from the United States. If you remember, Microsoft, for example, after the adoption of GDPR, promised to all its customers worldwide standards of data protection like those of the GDPR. And equally, Apple turned to become a company already before adoption of GDPR, which understood the huge wish of individuals in middle-income countries and in richer countries not to be snooped on, not by private parties and not by the state. So for Apple, certainly data protection and privacy has become also an important selling point. European industry, at least some parts of the European industry, unfortunately spend so much energy fighting against a reform of GDPR that they may have missed in some respects the strain, but I'm now more optimistic. I think there are many in Europe, also small and medium companies, which develop elements for new forms of privacy-friendly and data protection-friendly digital models, which will become very, very competitive and which already in the marketplace make a big difference. So for me, GDPR already today is an example of legislation which, yes, it concretizes a fundamental right, and by making certain forms of respect of this fundamental right obligatory, inspires new innovation in relation to differential privacy, in relation to encryption, also in relation to some elements of cybersecurity and data protection often go hand in hand. And this is for me also an orientation towards the future when we think about technologies like AI, which are supposed to be as prevalent in our lives as is electricity today. there are predictions which say that AI will take over many decision-making systems which humans are subject to in both the state and private and commercial functions. And it is certainly true that algorithms already, whether AI controlled or not, have an important influence on how we perceive the world today through the networks and platforms, most of which are run from the United States. And let me give you an example of what a difference a value orientation can make for the capability of decentralized innovation in Europe. If we take it serious that European policies stand for choice in the market, but also stand for maintaining a plurality of views in democracy, then of course it is a problem for us that the platform world is as concentrated as it is today. There are very few platforms which are very, very influential in opinion building, both in the United States and in Europe. We know that around 50% of our population already build their opinions, their political opinions, on the basis of what they see on the platform. And what they see on the platform is controlled by the algorithm which the platform defines. And the platform benefits from a syndrome which is called the winner takes it all, which means that once a platform has a critical size, especially when it is a social network platform, people feel constrained to go to this platform even if they don't like it. Why? Because they want to be connected to their friends who are already there, or for that matter, they want to benefit from these services which encompass more sales or more answers or more products or more answers to questions and better answers to questions than on other platforms. So this winner takes it all effect is an effect which increases the concentration in the market while reducing the choice for individuals. And the question is, what can we do about it? And here our value orientation starts. If we say, yes, we believe in the market economy, but we want a market economy with choice for the good functioning of the market, for innovation, but we also want choice for the good functioning of our democratic system, because it's not good for a democratic system that people increasingly build their opinions based basically on one algorithmic or two or three algorithmic systems. And one way to walk in this direction of more choice, for example, in social networks, is the theory of interconnection obligations. If we imagine a world in which we as individuals could choose a social network which is giving us opportunities according to our preferences, for example, according to our preferences whether we want to see advertisement or not, whether we want to receive targeted advertisement or not, whether we want to see certain content and not other content, whether we want to do these things in different languages and so on. If we could choose, then certainly there would be a market entry possibilities for innovators in Europe. But because of the winner takes it all right now, it's not a very attractive notion to start a new social network. But if we would have interconnectivity obligations in the sense that social networks starting from a certain size must open up to members of other social networks and allow interconnection, then this would create opportunities for plurality. it would invite entrepreneurs into the market of social networks, because the system of winner takes it all would be broken, or at least it would be attenuated. I'm not saying, and we have seen this in the telephony market before, I'm not saying that the previously strongest player will become very weak players. Usually they stay very, very strong. But interconnection duties certainly open up new possibilities. For example, I could imagine if we would have interconnection duties on social networks, it would be a very attractive notion for European big publishing houses to start networks which are working under different conditions for individuals and which are combined with exclusive content from the publishing house for the client of the network, or the other way around. Anybody who takes a subscription from the publishing house is part of the social network, and that becomes an attractive notion if it is possible, once one chooses to be on such a network, for example, of a European publisher, if one still can connect to the friends who are, for example, on Facebook and see their posts, but without being subject to the rules of Facebook, but only subject to the rules of the social platform one has chosen. So I think this is something which technologically would be possible. It is a question of how far we go in politically and through democracy shaping this market, whether we make it possible or not. It is a question of how serious we take our value orientation, even in a situation where some may be telling us, some lobbyists, oh, this is technologically impossible. I think the history, in particular, of regulation for environmental protection and sustainability, and we see this on a regular basis, for example, when we talk about the exhaust limits for cars and so on, has told us that industry, whenever it is convenient for them, tells us this or that is technologically not impossible. But we have to be critical towards those claims, and it has at least become my inclination to not believe it. And I can tell you a very nice example of the US Congressman Ed Markey from Massachusetts, who once told me, well, you know, if you go to Facebook and you say, you know, can you help us protecting children? Certainly you can recognize when a child is on the screen and using the Facebook and posting. You can see it from the children language they use. You can see it from how fast they type, how many spelling mistakes they make. It's pretty simple actually to see the age of those who use the tools. Then they say, oh, that's impossible, technologically impossible. Then you change dress and you put on a different hat and you go and say, good day, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to market my products to children of 12-year-old. Could you help me? And of course, Facebook is forthcoming and says, sure, we can target all 12-year-olds very precisely. We know how to do it. So I think in the debate on shaping the digital through values for new business opportunities in Europe, which combine and bring together in a coherent way profit orientation, plurality, democracy, and fundamental rights, it is utmost important that, of course, we don't believe just on first sight the arguments of technology companies and their lobbyists. And I would even go as far as saying, in discussing these opportunities, we have to be also very careful which academics we are listening to. The reality, unfortunately, in the market on academic advice on internet and society has become a little bit like the market on texts, academic text advice. As you may know, at least in some member states, and I talk here about the member state I know best, a large majority of professors on taxation in one way or the others works from time to time for one of the big 5 tax consultancies. And the unfortunate reality is because Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple are so financially potent, they are all at the top 10 of the American Stock Exchange, and not just for a short time now, they have made their way very deep into the academic establishment. So it has become my habit, at least, to follow the money and to look very carefully at the financing of the individuals I read papers from and also their institutes. And it is increasingly difficult to find academics which work under conditions where there is not, at least, let's say, call it softly, a willingness to please. And this willingness to please, of course, distorts the type of information we are getting for policy making in the European Union. So let me close by saying I do not believe that there is a contradiction between spreading innovation broadly in Europe. Much of the digital technologies and AI in particular are cultural technologies. They work on our minds, and therefore the cultural richness of Europe, starting from its multilingual composition right through to all the cultural capital we have in Europe, is an advantage in developing this technology. And it is no coincidence that, for example, the music-related type of digital platforms and AI, and I'm not only talking about Spotify, most of them actually come from Europe. It is also no coincidence that many elements of AI which are related to research which has cultural elements comes from Europe. I don't think that we have to go with our head down when we talk about innovation and the digital and AI in Europe, and we should not be misled by the fact that in the consumer market we have these five big players. You know, I grew up with Kellogg's cornflakes on my breakfast table every day, like many families, and we were all wearing jeans. So in the consumer market in Europe, we are used to, and Ford cars and so on, we are used to a very strong position of American companies. But the strength of Europe is not only in the consumer market, it is also in the B2B market. And I would say the COVID crisis, for example, and the production of vaccines has shown us, with the help of AI, has shown us how innovative Europe is. So there is no reason to go head down. I think we need to go with self-confidence, including self-confidence on the ability to maintain our values. And let me close by saying the reason why already before the strong intervention of the Chinese government in the digital markets, which is right now unfolding, AI investments, private AI investments dropped in China radically already years before, has to do something with the understanding of private investors in AI, that AI is a mind-related technology. It often somehow either tries to understand our minds or tries to replicate thinking processes of humans or manipulate humans. And in these functions, in this function of a technology which works on our minds individually and collectively, values are very important. And to say it in a short sentence, the reason why private investors have increasingly abstained on investing in AI in China, already before the strong government interventions in the digital industry, which we see now, is the realization that AI built in a dictatorship cannot be sold and used in the long term and with sustainable profits in democracies. It is a very value-ridden technology, and I think we should be optimistic on this, that if we believe that democracy and fundamental rights in this world have a future, so will have AI with these values built in by design and from the outset. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting and food for thought. I will not pose a question as the time went so quickly already. We are late from the dining table. I will go directly for Joanna Bryson, Professor of Ethics and Technology at Hertie School in Berlin. Please, Joanna.
Hi. Let me apologize. First of all, thank you for having me, and I apologize that I'm calling in from Heathrow. I very much wanted to be there in Brussels, but the trains just did not work from the UK. I hope that my slides are coming up soon. I'm stalling for you. Do we have my slides?
Yes, we do see them.
Okay, great. Let me say personally that I have not ever successfully gotten big tech funding, but a lot of my colleagues have, and some of them do good work and some of them do bad work, and I judge it by the work and by peer review and not by where they get their funding from. And in fact, I know that FEPS, for example, takes funding from GAFM too, so I was a little worried about that assault on academia earlier. But that's not the main point of my talk here. Let's go to the next slide. I am not a huge believer in interoperability because, I mean, it's great. It's really well for email, but it's not going to be enough. And I think people haven't thought hard enough about this problem of natural mobility, natural monopoly. Speaking of the previous speakers here, it used to be that people thought about natural monopoly very much in terms of the cost of a production of a unit. And of course, the cost of the productions of units does shrink in the digital sphere if you can think of somehow the services as units. But I'd like to think about it in a different way, which is just what happens when some kind of new technological innovation allows you to reach to more customers, right? Then what they're going to do is they're going to start going to the best, right? So it's not just about snowballing because we've accumulated data, and it's not something that just if we handed all that data to someone else, they would magically have as good of a product. There are so many different communication platforms out there and available that people did not hop to from Facebook and from WhatsApp. And incidentally, I'm old enough to remember when power went out routinely, and I remember telephones. The telephone connectivity, because of a large fire in a switching station in Illinois, was out for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. We have to think about these products that we're using. Are they something more like a utility? All right. So can I go to the next slide, please? This is just to say that get more wealth, right? It's a straightforward proposition. If you find a new technology that allows you to move, and can we go to the next slide, please? Incidentally, I don't totally agree with the Scheidel thing there, which is that only disasters reduce inequality. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I just brought that up to point out that we have tended to accumulate new technologies and ways to allow hierarchical organizations to work. And as Helena Malikova mentioned in the first session, the original goal of antitrust legislation was basically to make it easier for a government to be able to continue to have monopoly force within its borders. And I think it's really interesting that China is also very concerned about these large monopolies and how much power they're getting. And not just about companies, also about individuals, about how much influence. So I think this is we see the same problem sometimes shared between these supposedly extremely different governmental strategies. This is part of the reason why the EU had such a strong antitrust, as we heard in the history, is because it was believed by the Allies after World War II that what happened both in Japan and Germany was partly that national champions became too influential and were able to bring in autocratic power. So there was this belief that if you have such large companies, either they take over the government or the government takes over them, and either way you get autocracy. So that was one of the things we were trying to do. Let's go to the next slide. What I want to show here is that inequality is a social bad in so many different ways. it isn't only that we have sort of these disruptions potentially of autocracy. I think one of the interesting things in these periods of very high inequality is just we have high volatility. Individual actors have too much power. And so that can include that even the people who seem to have an awful lot of wealth have a lot of fear of things falling down. And so they do weirder and more desperate behavior. So we see the correlates with inequality include things like loss of social mobility, decline in innovation, and general insecurity, increase in warfare, things like that. At lower levels, increase in vandalism and various assaults on society. And what I like looking at this particular data drawn from the United States in the 20th century is that, first of all, you can see inequality isn't just caused by AI. Again, I think at that time it was more like coal and oil and telegraphs in the late 19th century. But also you see how the political polarization is highly correlated with it. And we have a recent paper indicating that that's partly because of just that, well, basically, as we heard before, diversity tends to get you the best solution. However, homogeneity gets you a more predictable solution. So if you're in a period of economic decline and you're facing some kind of a catastrophic event like the loss of your house or your business or your family, then you're going to choose the lower risk profile rather than the higher economic payoff. So that was a paper that came out in 2020, and we also have more data indicating this is probably true. So the inequality doesn't necessarily cause economic insecurity for the majority, but it does when it creates false scarcities, which is most of the time, certainly in the UK and the US. But this also explains why we haven't seen inequality driving polarization in China and Germany so much, because there was so much effort expended to make sure that the bottom of society was also being supported. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is some work with Helena Malikova, and it was in response to some slides that were claiming that, actually, I'm going to ask you to go back to this slide, but can we go forward one slide first? There were some slides claiming that the EU shouldn't even be in the business of regulating AI because it was so powerless, and that our regulations were somehow really harming us. And so what Helena and I did was, well, really, Helena did most of the work. She's a genius. We looked at the WIPO database, so to be objective, because we realized that these comparisons that only look at large market capitalization companies are disadvantaging regions that have extremely strong SMEs, which is what we want to do for resilience, for diversity. So we looked at the WIPO database of any company that had at least 2 patents in 2019, because her time is valuable, so we didn't chase one patent. And it's only one of the possible. It's not saying this is all the patents that was ever done in AI in 2019, but it's one of the subsets. So it's a slightly arbitrary measure. What you can see from this slide is what the upshot was, which is that the EU and China proved to be more comparable. There's 2 different measures here, and basically independent. One is the market capitalization, the combined aggregated market capitalization of where the innovation is coming from. And the other is the total number of patents in this particular category in the WIPO database. What you see is that the US is still dominating the world, but the rest of the world, besides China and the EU, is doing really well. And the China and the EU are somewhat comparable. Can we go back to that slide so we can blow that up and look at it a little more carefully? Thank you so much. I want to point out that, look, both IP, and now Helena doesn't agree with this, but both IP and market capitalization are based on decisions by corporations. It's not that Apple and Facebook don't innovate, it's that they don't choose to defend their innovations in courts. They're not playing the game that Google and Microsoft and IBM are playing of, like, chasing talent in that particular way, or of trying to get power in that particular way. And also, I mean, look at Huawei, look at Robert Bosch. The decision to go public is just the first decision about how much emphasis are you going to make on trying to make your market share really large. And all of us who know people who work in tech companies will have heard them talking about what should we do this year? What should be our strategy? Should we be working on trying to grow our market capitalization? That is a strategic choice. So a strategic choice about whether you focus on being really good at something. IBM was around working with the Nazis too, right? The IBM's been successful for decades. There's domination, including by European companies, in specific sectors, like Cloudflare, who are a company that do that defend you against denial of service attacks, right? There's companies that just sit there and they say, this is what we do. And there's nothing wrong with them. Okay, let's go on 2 slides now. I want to talk quickly about remedies. So if we can get interoperability to work, if you can get people to switch between the system to a worse system, just because you brought their email, great, fantastic. But I think we have to look at this problem about what if there really is the best cybersecurity, the best social network or something. Well, one thing you can do is, of course, what China did, and exclude at least partially access to the best providers. And to some extent, the GDPR might be doing that. I just had an argument about whether Luxembourg really should be arguing about it's requiring our data to be within Luxembourg. Okay, how many companies are going to do work if they have to have servers in Luxembourg? Maybe not the best. Maybe Luxembourg will therefore get some really great stuff growing up in its home market. I don't know. But the other option that people have been talking about for about a decade now is regulating these things as utilities, saying, okay, we realize that there's value in having this one really good service in this particular thing. If we're going to do that, it's not a total solution. And I'm sorry about that. But again, look at the history of AT&T. Look at the history of, sorry about the person talking behind me. Can't be doing anything dumb. Okay, they had a lot of trouble figuring out when to break it up or what to do. But yeah, and I particularly like this solution that I think worked extremely well when they released all the IP for AT&T. They still owned it. They could still use their patents, but other people could use them too. It didn't help with spreading telephone technology in the US, but it did open up transistor radios, computers, a lot of the technological dominance we've seen there. So those kinds of remedies to bring down this excessive amount of power of some of these companies might be a strategy. I still think disaggregation along product lines makes a lot of sense, and I don't trust the Facebook lady who said that wasn't true. But finally, I want to put forward another idea that I haven't heard a lot of places, which is I want to see sort of a geographical disaggregation. So can we actually force people to have a clone of themselves that is actually under only our regulation? Obviously, this isn't going to work for a very small, maybe Switzerland would have trouble arguing this. But the EU is 450 million people. India is 1 billion. Could we actually say, we want to see your servers here? And incidentally, I find it terrifying that, having lived through both Trump and Brexit elections, that Google goes around saying, oh yeah, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, that's a region. No, it's not. The EU is our jurisdiction, is our regulatory jurisdiction. Please talk to the EU, not just to people who happen to have some German speakers in their countries. But I am very worried about some of the things I've heard, in closed-door meetings about people trying to compete. For example, having universities compete with Amazon web services. We will not be able to scale at the same rate. We will not be able to build hardware at the same rate. So Airbus is cool. There's no question now that Airbus is better than Boeing, but that's a huge investment, and I'm not sure we can do it in every single one of the digital sectors. So we need some more ideas. I know these aren't complete, but thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Joanna. And also we go forward to next speaker, Philip Lorenz, who is a project director on AI and foreign policy in the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung.
Yeah, we can talk about the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung as SNV. I think that's easier. I'll try to share my presentation so that I can click through it on my own. And so in my input, I want to talk about how industrial inputs that artificial intelligence is comprised of influence AI governance, and how AI standardization and also AI patents relate to AI governance. And so I took the liberty as a jump-off point to dissect a couple of main theses from the S&D AIDA webinar final program. So first thesis was the market dominance and market concentration of a small number of big tech companies which are developing AI technologies and investing in AI ventures is increasingly becoming a matter of concern. Another one is large firms are much better placed to take advantage of the opportunities afforded by AI to derive further competitive advantage over their SME counterparts. So where do large tech companies or multinationals take their power and dominance in artificial intelligence from? In order to answer this question, you need to look at AI's industrial inputs, or more specifically, the resources of machine learning. And so first of all, you need data, especially training data is highly relevant, and the access to the data. Then you have specialized AI hardware, which is another important component. And then you need to look at the algorithmic development, AI software, and platforms that you can use to build neural networks. And then, of course, you need to look at the engineering talent pool. And there's a fierce battle going on for the best talent, although grad level and undergrad levels are becoming more and more overcrowded by students. But we're not there yet to satisfy the demand. And how do large multinational companies do it? They leverage the AI resources through advanced research labs. Google has its own, so does Facebook. OpenAI just recently joined forces with Microsoft. They struck a deal of $1 billion to access also the Microsoft Azure cloud infrastructure. But also Siemens, for instance, in Germany, and Bosch have established their own research centers where they try to hire the best talent and develop their tailor-made technologies. And if you cannot have access, or if you want to have access to excellent European AI talent as well, you open up shop. For instance, in Berlin, Amazon is doing this, IBM is doing so as well. IBM is also doing it in Zurich, where they have established a large lab. But so do large mirror companies from China, as for instance Alibaba and Tencent. They all try to attract the best talent, and they all invest heavily in AI hardware. Elon Musk put it out in a tweet recently that AI talent should consider to join forces with his company. Only the most excellent talent matters. And if you cannot move to Palo Alto or Austin, that's acceptable. If you're extremely talented, then you can also work from abroad. So what's the signature workforce structure of AI companies? And this is where it gets tough for SMEs to replicate this. And this is a point of great concern, because you need some sort of a talent pyramid where you have machine learning specialists at the top that could easily work at the best international research centers as well. You need data scientists and data engineers that work on prediction models, and on the infrastructure and the architecture to reach prediction levels. And you need a huge amount of people that are software developers that code your technology. And this is the signature workforce structure for advanced tech clusters such as the Silicon Valley. And this is hard to replicate for companies that are not located, let's say, in the clusters such as London or San Francisco or the Bay Area or Berlin, but are more on the rural part of the country, as it is, for instance, also for a couple of hidden champions in Germany in manufacturing. And this is something to have in the back of your minds. Then again, industrial inputs, very important for the deep learning applications, is specialized hardware for both training and inference of the model. You have NVIDIA, who has a large market share. You have Tesla, that has been developing its own chip that they have produced by Samsung. And you see that's this fusion between AI software and specialized hardware that really targets the application on board here for object recognition of Tesla's vehicles. And then you have AWS that has recently announced to be producing their own specialized hardware for inference as well, for their cloud, of course. And there you can buy packages, you can buy AI services and products that run on the cloud. That's a huge thing for tech companies that have large cloud infrastructure, that they can offer you specialized AI software, and you can tap into their huge AI hardware. This looks like this when you talk about Google's tensor processing units stacked here for cloud services. So if you control AI's industrial inputs, you have the ability to shape AI development. Another important way on how you can shape AI development and AI governance is if you look at standardization, AI or technical AI standardization. This is a thing that is often overlooked by policymakers, but it's highly important and of high relevance. In blue, you can see political fora that are targeted with governing aspects of ethical AI or trustworthiness. In green, you can see on the international level, the ISO, IEC, and IEEE that are concerned with international tech standardization, also in so-called ethical AI, and they are very active. And you have CEN and CENELEC on the European level. And if you look closer, and if you look at the international fora with the biggest impact on the international regulatory framework, of course, you have the European Union with the draft proposal of the European Commission on the AI law and on the AI Act. You have the Council of Europe that's preparing a framework. You have, but also CEN and CENELEC that have been working, that are starting to work on tech standards for ethical AI only recently. And of course, you have ISO and IEC that have been working on elements of ethical AI standardization since about 6 or 7 years. And there you have, again, large multinational tech companies sitting in the driving seat and are debating on industry standards, also not only on AI hardware, but also on ethical aspects of artificial intelligence. And as you may know, the AI Act has left the door wide open for industry to participate in standard setting for the European single market. And this is a key concern, that you have to enable European SMEs to sit at the table and to present their ideas on industry standards. Otherwise, you have to deal with large multinational companies that will be dictating also how European tech standards might look like in the future. If you look at the biggest impact on international AI policy, you have the OECD, highly powerful discussion forum with lots of experts. You have the Global Partnership on AI, but also private sector and large multinationals are well placed using the Partnership on AI as a sort of a lobbying consortia. So another main thesis was, at the same time, public investments on AI should focus towards an increased AI diversity in research and innovation. And increased diversification will ensure a more transparent and democratic environment in the field of AI. Well, if you look at patent data, you may see that 89% of patent families are related to one single AI technology. This is machine learning. So, and if you talk to representatives from private sector companies that use AI, they tell you, well, we don't see that machine learning applications are not scaling. If we add one additional unit of compute, we don't have to change anything with regards to our algorithm. Compute will scale the accuracy of the system. And this is also reflected in the academic literature, that machine learning is the dominant technology currently. This is also reflected here in this graph. And if you look at the sectors of relevance, you see that transportation and telecommunications are the sectors that are most dominant. There's an upside here, good news. You see that specialized companies dominate in their business sector. And if you look at European companies that are strong in particular sectors such as life and medical sciences, you see Siemens and Philips providing huge amounts of patents in transportation. This goes for Robert Bosch as well, or in physical sciences and engineering. This goes for Siemens. So if you look at patenting, and this is another important field that policymakers should consider, there's an inventive cycle. So you use R&D spending to create innovation, then you file a patent, and then you license the patent out, and you receive revenue that you can then again push into research and development spending. This is a cycle that keeps alive invention, also for European companies. This could be distorted by the take of China in developing advanced machine learning technologies. As you may see, the patent applications for different offices, China has been rising dramatically. And what is the case in China? You receive, as a tech company, huge subsidies from the government that you can additionally push into your research and development spending, and this might lead you to outperform international competitors that may not be able to match this. Again, let's look at another section that is interesting to consider for policymakers. If you look at top 5G standard essential patents, and a standard essential patent is a patent which protects technology that has been selected for use in an industry standard. And without access to the technology that is protected by the patent, well, the standard cannot be used. You see that China is also Chinese companies are owning huge amounts of standard essential patents. And you might be thinking, well, I'm concerned at the moment that there might be a parallel here, that we could see the same effect in standard essential patents for machine learning or for AI technologies as well. There's not much literature yet. We are working on this as well. But you see an early scientific paper on this fact that there is a rise in standard essential patents based on machine learning technologies. And this might lead European industries to be more and more dependent upon standard essential patent holders from countries such as the US or China in the future, and this is likely to lock in also economic dominance of these companies. So this is my take on it, and happy to have given you some overview on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And then we do have the last speaker before the possible questions for the specialist we have heard today. And the speaker is Divya Siddharth, a social technologist from the Radical Exchange.
Hello.
We do hear you, but not see you yet.
Hello?
Now the voice and picture. Yes, good.
Do you have my slides by any chance? Ah, wonderful. Okay. I will try to go quite quickly because I know we don't have much time for questions. And I think we've covered, if we can go to the next slide, some of the broader points here. We've all been talking about the centralization potential of these technologies. I think one thing that I'd like to cover is sort of these three pieces of the current AI vision, which I would say each have different societal impacts that might be concerning. The first is human competition, and we see this evident through targets of achieving human parity benchmarks. And that's how a lot of these algorithms are determined whether or not they're successful. And I think the major concern here is in the short and long term, this can set the relationship between humans and AI systems as one of competition rather than one of cooperation and augmentation. So I think we've sort of spoken a little bit about the labor consequences of AI in the other talks, so I won't belabor the point. But if we are focusing on human competition metrics for success, no matter what the safeguards are that we put in on the economic side, this is a major concern because the goal doesn't end up being augmentation, it ends up being replacement. So I think one major target that we can have in terms of, well, humanizing or creating beneficial impacts from AI is turning away from human parity and human competition metrics across the board. And I think particularly for the most well-funded organizations in this space, human competition is what gets them that funding, right? So is what keeps pushing in that direction. So we can move away from human competition benchmarks on the labor side, but also more broadly philosophically. This creates externalities to workers in imperfect labor markets, and we can really strike at that pillar. And I think there isn't good evidence that human competitive benchmarks are even the most productive or innovative way to build AI systems. a lot of our most useful technologies don't replace humans, don't aim to do what we can do. They facilitate interaction. We can see that right now. Video conferencing technology has probably been the most productivity enhancing technology of the past 2 years, and it doesn't have any, indication or idea of trying to replace what humans can do or try to make decisions for them. It's about facilitating cooperation and deliberation. So I think, one thing we can do to move away from human competition is in that direction. The second piece here, I guess we'll go on to the next slide. So the second piece here is autonomy. And we've discussed some of the negative impacts of autonomy and aiming for autonomy already, but I don't think we've called it out as one of the goals of the current AI vision. And here, autonomy means, targeting the increasing independence of these systems from human direction and agency, which is clear across when we say, well, engagement maximizing algorithms are causing X problems or causing polarization or misinformation or things like this. The reason that's happening is we're trying to create autonomous decision-making systems. A lot of the unequal impacts of AI come into play here. And so, moving away from targeting autonomy to, again, trying to create systems that, work in tandem with humans. And I think this is also, a fundamental misunderstanding of what intelligence is, because what we deem as intelligent is embedded in systems, is contingent, it's co-created, it's through culture and surroundings and network. And if we're aiming for autonomy in an algorithm, very practically, we're removing a lot of context from the information that not only that algorithm sees, but that we as humans who are consumers of those algorithms end up seeing. And so this can not only, move us towards a future in which there isn't human decision-making input and it leads to all of these difficult externalities, it also has the adverse effect of obscuring external agency and input where it already exists. So we already know that a lot of human input is necessary for AI algorithms, from data labor, machine labeling of algorithms, image processing, and all of these things are often done by humans. And so if we're moving towards emphasis on autonomy, I think this both leads us to, well, we don't have humans in the decision-making loop, but we're also underpaying and undervaluing the folks that are in that space right now. And so I think through both human competition and autonomy, there is just an incentive structure pushing on devaluing human input into these systems and trying to replace humans longer term, which is simply not useful, and in the short term leads to all of these algorithms and alignment issues that we're seeing across, social media and other aspects in the digital sphere. And the third piece I'll talk about is centralization, and I think this one's pretty obvious and others have covered it. And this is essentially, if we can go to the next slide, the centralization of massive resources and decision-making power at the direction of a small group. And this ends up being a consequence of the first two. We've already discussed at length, there is major data and compute requirements for a lot of these models. And the reason those requirements exist is because we're aiming for human competing models that can act autonomously. And of course, then you're going to require a huge amount of training data and a huge amount of compute to make that happen. And so centralization is just a natural consequence of the type of AI we're trying to build. If you want to build human competing autonomous AI, you're going to end up centralizing compute and data. And that means, as we've discussed, powerful organizations, of which there aren't that many, are going to be the ones that are building this type of AI. And I think that's a major problem for many of the reasons that folks have already discussed. But I would take a slightly different tactic and say, do we need to aim for these goals? And I think we can say, we don't want this to be centralized in major corporations or in a couple of nation states. This should be much more diverse, and I agree with all of those points. But some of that is only necessary when we're aiming for AI that is trying to compete with humans and is trying to make autonomous decisions. And if we recognize that the real productivity and innovation potential of these technologies is not in competing with humans, is not in making autonomous decisions, but in really augmenting human capacity, then we actually reduce the need for some of those inputs around data and compute that lead to centralization. So I think, we do want to diversify, we do want to decentralize, and maybe some of these algorithms will require these goals, but largely our technology that's been most effective doesn't compete with humans, it doesn't try to make autonomous decisions. And so we can decentralize by saying we can have better and more useful and more human-centered goals that don't require this centralization from the beginning. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to spend the remainder of my time, let's skip this one, I'm hoping that we have time for questions, although I'm not sure there's much I can do about it. But I think these are some of the types of approaches that move beyond this narrow kind of vision of human computing on autonomous AI systems into saying, well, let's preserve privacy, right? Let's build out things like data cooperatives and data trusts instead of a single organization trying to monopolize all of this data. Let's allow communities to answer questions about, the things that are happening in their own spaces. On the autonomy side, on the competition side, right, let's move away from trying to reach human level speech or human level vision and really think about comparative advantage targeting. And there's lots of wonderful work happening there on human complementarity metrics instead of human competition metrics, on an AI services model that looks much more at, okay, what are small scale services that artificial intelligence algorithms can do that are transparent and regulable, rather than these kind of much bigger models that we don't have a sense of and that are very opaque. And I think more broadly, our panel is on technological diversification, and we've talked a lot about diversifying the AI space. I would urge us to say, let's diversify beyond the AI space. Let's talk about AI less, right? Let's have less of a focus on AI as the major frontier of technology, because it really doesn't have to be. And I think part of the reason AI is so central to so many of our conversations is because it's being funded to this degree, and these narratives about it being the frontier are so central. But if we think about it, object-oriented programming, the personal computer, video interaction, like the internet, all of these kinds of things are completely different technological frontiers from what AI is considering, and could be models for a much more networked and distributed type of technological future. So that column on the right, I think, talks about, well, what are broader approaches around human-computer interaction, participatory design, social technology, decentralized tech. Don't have the time to go into all of those, would be delighted to talk about them later. But I think we can broaden our scope to say, it is a little bit the job of folks who are in this space and thinking about the adverse impacts of AI to also move beyond AI and try to build other kinds of technology that are more useful and more just and equitable for broader society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope all the speakers are still online, and as we do have some 10 minutes, it means like less than 2 minutes each, so we can finish almost in time. So if I go around and I let you to comment one other speaker, and you can choose any idea presented today, or I can pick you a question. And so, Paul, you may start. So you can choose to comment a colleague who was speaking here, or then you can answer my short question: can EU do much alone, or should we find international cooperation to be able to make the big step towards diversity? I know that you have been leading negotiating the EU-US privacy shield and been in contact with US a lot. Is Paul online? Yes.
Mr. Nemetz, please click on the speak button.
On the microphone. Now it's on. Is it on?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Please activate.
Okay.
Please activate your mic, your webcam.
This is a complicated system. I don't understand which button I have to press. I press on the camera, then it says select camera device, turn off integrated camera. Boy. Okay. All right. So I think we have to be self-confident, and of course in a European Union of so many member states, large and small, it's easy to say, let's be self-confident, because we all are socialized in a very different way. Some of us come from political and cultural backgrounds which are, let's say, not very self-confident. But I think as a union as a whole, we can be confident. We have a very big internal market. It's a very big buying power. It's not a coincidence that if we set rules, much of the world is not only watching, but is often copying our rules because people want to sell into Europe. I would also say that economically speaking, we have a very diverse economic base, very innovative. So I don't think that there is a need to make ourselves, let's say, dependent on the regulatory and technological progress elsewhere. Probably actually Europe has a little bit too much of, a constant whining about, the US or China. I think we have to focus more on our own strengths and our own ability to innovate, including our innovation in democracy. You see, being innovative in democracy, I think, is one of the key competitive advantages of Europe over the United States. In Washington, it's very difficult to get through laws. It's a very polarized society, too many checks and balances in the political system. There's a huge fragmentation of law, for example, on cybersecurity and data protection and privacy in the US, because states have started to make these laws, the California data protection. So, all these pleas, it would be much better if we would do like the Americans, or it would be much better if we would do like China. I don't think they are convincing. I mean, on China, I can only say, from China, you have to take the whole package, including dictatorship. So, to be short, I think we have the strengths and the ability to go our own way. But of course, things are easier if we can take others along. So we must remain open for dialogue. We must much more carry our thinking elsewhere rather than trying to copy what others are doing. I think carrying our thinking elsewhere, with self-confidence and the conviction that we will find our own way in a democratic process which respects fundamental rights.
Yes, thank you. Manuel Bedia, do you want to comment a colleague, a statement taken today, or you want to elaborate what sector is really lost opportunities that we do not have research dedicated to them, or to what sector, because it's so much interest by the companies to target the AI sectors. You touched it a little bit. Or you want a comment a colleague?
Para mí es fundamental el tema de cómo abordarlo educativamente, desde el punto de vista de la educación. O sea, yo creo que muchos de los retos que nos supone tener una diversidad temática es que los perfiles profesionales que llegan a las empresas no sean homogéneos, vengan de formaciones distintas y se acerquen al ámbito de la inteligencia artificial desde experiencias de conocimiento distintas. O sea, creo que muchos de las soluciones que podamos encontrar para promocionar la diversidad temática son también las que podamos encontrar para promocionar la interdisciplinaridad. O sea, que yo creo que las apuestas del mundo educativo deben ir a perfiles más generalistas, más híbridos. Esa sería una reflexión final que me gustaría compartir.
Yes, thank you. Joanna Bryson, did you find some topic you want to comment from the colleague? Or I have a question that you published a study that some interest groups have inflated the estimated costs of upcoming AI legislation. You wrote a paper with the Meri Haataja. And yes, we have heard it as a legislators that it will be very difficult and expensive. What kind of reception did your analysis has received after publication that it is not that expensive? The AI legislation proposed. You want to comment that, or did you find something interesting? Please stick to 1 minute.
1 minute, 2, I hope. I want to say very quickly that I forgot to mention the importance of transnational redistribution of revenue. The Biden administration, Macron, when he talked about digital, but I think this is general. I think I actually will echo the most recent speaker in saying that when we get tied into knots thinking that AI is human, we screw up stuff that we already had solved. We already have ideas about what are the obligations of manufacturers. And so again, we should be looking at people who are creating exceptions for themselves and figure out the new real problems. And I very much want to echo along with what Philip said, that what he talked about is very much like what's going on with the automobile, or was going on with the automobiles, with this interuse. So we had a lot of panic about politics of who was building the cars in the 20th century. Maybe we'll get to that place where we're working together again here. Also, please just have a look at Twitter. There has been some more commentary there, and people love our analysis. Yes, it's just true that in fact, a lot of the project. Well, anyway, just look it up. And thank you for pronouncing my co-author's name better than I can.
Thank you. You were quick enough, but unfortunately the techniques here came to say that we have to empty the room. So this is a disadvantage of not being fully digital, but hybrid mode. So on my behalf, I will thank you and apologize to speakers that we were not able to take you more. But I give the place for the finalizing closing words to Brando Benifei from IMCO committee, please.
Thank you, Mia Petra. And I would like to thank all the speakers in this very interesting sequence of panels for their insightful presentations that enriched our reflections on the democratization of the digital world and of new technologies, as well as our moderators, Christel and Mia Petra again, who kept the debate alive. I believe it is very timely for us to have this debate as we are continuing the work on the DSA and DMA, and as we are about to start the parliamentary work on the Artificial Intelligence Act. In a scene-setting presentation by Ms. Malikova of DG Comp, we've seen the evolution of EU competition law over the years, which is important to fully grasp how and why digital services need the targeted ex-ante measures of DMA. We heard Mr. Reina from BEUC making the important link between the DMA and the AIA. Indeed, these files need to be consistent with each other. And the work that our colleagues are doing on the DMA in ensuring more fairness in the digital single market is a work that we will need to continue with the AI Act. Linked to this is the crucial role of interoperability mentioned by several speakers, in particular by Professor Marsden and also by Paul Nemitz. We have seen with great interest how interoperable social media would work. Right now, it may sound a bit futuristic, but if this happened with email, why can't it be in this case? Which is why we have been working to strengthen provisions on interoperability and portability in all digital files, and we will continue to do so. We cannot continue to be governed by the terms and conditions of a few tech companies. We have heard from Ms. Schumann from ETUC important words that I totally agree on what is missing from the AI Act in its impact on the workplace. We have gained more insights on the role of investments, patents, research and talent in the virtuous circle of innovation to see where we stand in the global competition on new technologies and AI. Indeed, the international geopolitical dimension is also an important factor to take into consideration. The political debate on AI, for example, is polarized between those who say we need to compete with the USA and China, and those like us who do not think competition is a value per se. But we cannot deny that depending on AI systems that could entail negative impacts on fundamental rights because they are designed and trained with a different set of values than European ones cannot be an option, which is why we insist on building a European model for AI in the first place. The role of public investment is, of course, fundamental. For too long, industrial policies and strategies have been set aside and research has been given a marginal role, at least in some member states. And it is positive that we finally rediscover the role of public investment in leveraging resources and have a European industrial strategy. The pandemic has given an involuntary boost to this, but for us it was clear already many years ago. Without all this, we could not strengthen the innovation ecosystem we need in order to support our researchers and our many excellences in Europe, which also include the proper infrastructure, like quantum computers, for example. This, of course, cannot overlook the issue of skills, which we should discuss more. There is still a lot to do in this sense, as new technologies change faster than educational programs, which is a dilemma we need to tackle seriously in an integrated way, also taking into account the role of lifelong learning, which will be crucial in this sense. So, dear friends and comrades, thank you again to all of you and to all of our audience for staying with us through this dense discussion, which shows us how much we still have to do to have a truly fair digital single market. I can assure you that we are all united in this fight. We heard also from many colleagues in this debate, and I'm sure that both in the AIDA committee, in which I work as shadow rapporteur for the group, and in the AI Act, we will be able to integrate all these dimensions. Thank you very much, and let's continue fighting for a better digital Europe with a human-centered approach. Thank you very much.